There is a particular kind of arrogance that only wealthy people can afford, and it is this: the absolute conviction that they can look at a man in grease-stained coveralls, standing beside a lift in a garage that smells like motor oil and old rubber, and know, instantly and completely, everything that man will ever be worth. My parents had that arrogance in abundance. It was the currency they traded in more fluently than dollars. And on the night I told them I was marrying Diego Cruz, a mechanic who worked 6 days a week at a small independent garage on the edge of our town, my father looked at me across the dining room table of the house I grew up in and said, with the calm, terrible certainty of a man who believed he was simply stating a fact rather than delivering an ultimatum, "If you marry that man, Sophie, you are no longer my daughter. I am Sophie Bennett, Sophie Cruz now, and have been for 9 years. And I want to tell you what happened after I chose him anyway." Because 10 years later, my parents sat across a conference room table from the man who now controlled the fate of the company that had defined their entire identity, and they did not recognize him at first. Not because he had changed so much, but because they had never actually looked at him closely enough, not once in all the years they'd known him, to see who he really was. This is the story of the family that discarded me for loving a man they judged by his hands instead of his heart, and the decade it took for those same hands to hold their entire future in them. I grew up in a house that looked like it belonged on a postcard. 6 bedrooms, a circular driveway lined with maple trees my mother had imported from a nursery 2 states away because she didn't like the common maples sold locally, a swimming pool that was heated year-round, despite being used maybe 15 days out of the year. My father, Gerald Bennett, had built Bennett Properties Group from a single strip mall his own father left him into, one of the largest commercial real estate development firms in the state, and by the time I was in high school, the Bennett name opened doors at every country club, every charity gala, every private school admissions office within 100 miles. My mother, Vivian, had married into that name from a family with old money and older opinions, and she had spent the entirety of my childhood curating our family's image with the precision of a woman who understood instinctively that appearances were not simply important. They were, in her world, the entire point. She corrected the way I sat at dinner. She vetted the friends I brought home, quietly steering me away from anyone whose parents didn't belong to the right clubs or hold the right positions. She once returned an entire wardrobe I'd bought myself with babysitting money because the brands, in her words, said something about us that we don't want said. My older sister Whitney was the family's crown jewel, the daughter who did everything correctly, who married Bradley Ashford, the son of my father's longtime attorney, in a wedding that made the society pages and cost, by my mother's own later admission, close to $400,000. Whitney understood the family's rules instinctively, the way some people understand music or math without ever needing to be taught the underlying theory. I never did. I was the daughter who asked too many questions at dinner, who preferred books to galas, who studied economics at a state school instead of the small liberal arts college my parents preferred because I wanted an education, not a finishing school with a diploma attached. I was 22 years old, home from college for the summer and working part-time at a small accounting firm downtown to build my resume before graduation, when my car, a hand-me-down sedan with nearly 200,000 miles on it that my father had refused to replace, insisting it built character for me to drive something unglamorous while Whitney drove a new Audi, broke down in the parking lot of a strip mall 3 blocks from the office. I called the first garage listed in my search results, a small independent shop called Cruz Automotive, and 20 minutes later, a tow truck arrived, driven by a man with dark, tired eyes, forearms marked with old scars from years of work, and a quiet, unhurried way of speaking that I found myself listening to more closely than I meant to. His name was Diego Cruz. He was 26, 4 years older than me, And he owned the garage. Not worked there. Owned it. A detail I learned only when I saw his name on the business license taped inside the office window, while I waited for my car's diagnosis. He explained what was wrong with my transmission in plain, patient language, without the condescension I'd grown used to from men who assumed a young woman couldn't follow mechanical explanations. And when I asked how much the repair would cost, he quoted me a number so much lower than I'd braced for that I actually laughed out loud, assuming he'd misspoken. "I don't inflate prices for people who don't know better," he told me, and something about the plain, unbothered honesty of that sentence, so different from the careful, calculated language everyone in my parents' world used, where every kindness came with an invisible price tag attached, caught in my chest and did not let go. I started finding excuses to bring my car back. An oil change I didn't strictly need yet. A strange noise that turned out to be nothing more than a loose piece of trim. Diego noticed, I think, faster than I did, and one Friday afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag that had long since stopped being able to actually clean anything, he asked if I wanted to get dinner sometime, somewhere that wasn't attached to a repair invoice. I said yes before I'd fully finished processing the question. What I did not know that afternoon, what I would not learn until nearly 4 years into our relationship, long after I had already fallen completely, irreversibly in love with him, was that Diego Cruz had inherited that garage from an uncle who'd raised him after his own parents died in a car accident when he was 9 years old, and had spent the years since building something far larger and quieter than a single repair shop on the edge of town, something he had deliberately, carefully, kept hidden from almost everyone in his life, including, for longer than I would ever fully forgive myself for, me. But that summer, I only knew that he was kind and steady, and looked at me like I was worth listening to rather than worth managing, and I did not yet understand how completely that single, simple fact would set me on a collision course with the family I had spent 22 years trying and failing to please. I want to explain why Diego hid his wealth from me, because I think it matters, and because it is the single detail about our early relationship that people find hardest to believe when I tell this story. Diego's uncle, Ernesto Cruz, the man who raised him after his parents' death, had built the original garage from nothing over 30 years, and had taught Diego, alongside every mechanical skill he possessed, a philosophy about money that Diego carried like scripture, that a person's worth had nothing to do with what they owned, and that the fastest way to attract people who wanted your money instead of your company was to let them know, up front, exactly how much of it you had. Ernesto had been right to worry. Diego's first serious relationship in his early 20s had been with a woman named Kayla, who had discovered 6 months in that the modest garage Diego appeared to run was, in fact, the smallest and least significant of nearly a dozen businesses he controlled through a private holding company he'd built starting at 19 years old, a story I'll come back to, because it matters. And who had, upon learning this, transformed almost overnight from a woman who claimed to love his simplicity into a woman who suddenly had a great many opinions about which properties they should buy and which social circles they should now be moving in. Diego ended that relationship within weeks of the discovery, not because Kayla wanted more from life, but because he understood, with a clarity that had cost him real pain to earn, that she had never actually loved the man in the coveralls at all. She had simply been waiting, patiently, to discover what he was worth underneath them. After Kayla, Diego made a decision that he told me about only years into our own relationship. Sitting on the porch of the first house we bought together, his voice quiet and a little embarrassed, the way people sound when they're confessing something they know, in retrospect, was probably an overcorrection. He decided he would never again reveal his full financial situation to a woman until he was completely certain, not reasonably certain, completely certain that she loved the version of him standing in the garage, exactly as he appeared, oil-stained coveralls and modest sedan and all. He built, over the years that followed, a life carefully designed to obscure the truth without technically lying about it. He drove an old pickup truck instead of anything expensive. He lived in a small apartment above the garage, rather than any of the properties his holding company owned. He worked the counter and the lift himself most days, genuinely loving the mechanical work in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with a real, abiding passion for understanding how things worked, a passion that had, in fact, been the entire engine behind the empire he'd quietly built. Diego Cruz, it turned out, had discovered at 19 years old, while flipping salvaged classic cars out of his uncle's garage for extra money during a slow season, that he had an extraordinary eye for undervalued assets. First cars, then, as his small profits compounded, distressed small businesses that other investors overlooked because they lacked the patience or expertise to see what could be fixed rather than simply written off. By 22, he had used the profits from a string of successful car restorations to acquire a small failing auto parts distributor, turned it profitable within 18 months using efficiencies he understood instinctively from years spent in an actual garage, and sold it for 4 times what he'd paid. By 24, 2 years before I met him, he had formalized his growing collection of investments into a private holding company he called Ironwood Capital, named for the tree his uncle Ernesto had planted the year he took Diego in, a tree that, Diego told me once, doesn't grow fast and doesn't bend easy and outlives almost everything planted around it. By the time I broke down in that strip mall parking lot, Ironwood Capital controlled 11 separate businesses across 4 states, with a combined value that would have stunned my father into silence had he known, though he would not learn any of it, not truly, for nearly a decade. I dated Diego for 8 months before I noticed the first crack in the careful simplicity he'd constructed. A moment when a business call came through during dinner, and the man on the other end of the line addressed him with a deference that seemed strange for a call about, ostensibly, a garage supply order. I asked him about it afterward, and he was quiet for a long moment before telling me, haltingly, an incomplete version of the truth, that he did some investing on the side, that it was more complicated than the garage, that he'd tell me the whole story eventually, when the time felt right. I did not push. I want to be honest that this was not entirely selflessness on my part. Some quiet part of me, raised in a house where money was the only language spoken fluently, found a strange private relief in the idea that Diego might have more resources than he let on, even as I told myself, truthfully, that it changed nothing about how I felt for him. I loved him for the way he explained transmission problems without condescension, for the quiet, unhurried patience he brought to everything, for the fact that he remembered, without being told twice, that I took my coffee black and hated cilantro and got anxious in loud restaurants. Whatever else he was, underneath the coveralls, felt, in those early months, like a detail rather than a definition. It would take 4 more years, a wedding my parents refused to attend, and a night I will never fully forget, for me to learn exactly how large that detail actually was. I brought Diego home to meet my parents 9 months after we started dating. On a Sunday evening my mother had specifically requested, framing it as, getting to know the young man you've been spending so much time with. In a tone that made clear, even before he arrived, that she had already formed her conclusions and was simply gathering evidence to support them. Diego wore the nicest clothes he owned, a button-down shirt and slacks that I could tell, immediately, had cost him real thought and effort. The effort of a man trying to show respect to people he did not yet understand, were incapable of receiving it from someone in his position. He brought a bottle of wine he'd asked the shop owner to help him select, and a bouquet of flowers for my mother, and he shook my father's hand with a firm, direct grip and looked him steadily in the eye. And I remember feeling, in that first minute, a fragile, hopeful pride that maybe, despite everything I knew about my parents, this evening might go better than I feared. It did not go better than I feared. My father spent the first 20 minutes of dinner asking Diego a series of questions that were, on their surface, ordinary small talk. Where did you go to school? What does your family do? How did you end up in the automotive business? But that were, underneath, a kind of interrogation designed to establish, as efficiently as possible, exactly where Diego ranked in the hierarchy my father used to sort every person he ever met. Diego answered honestly, plainly, without embellishment and without apology. He'd gone to the local community college for 2 years before deciding it wasn't the right fit. His parents had died when he was 9. His uncle had raised him and taught him the trade. He owned a small garage that kept him busy and that he genuinely loved. I watched my father's face shift, almost imperceptibly, with each answer, the polite, performative interest draining out of it and being replaced by something colder. Something I recognized from years of watching him assess business partners and dismiss the ones who didn't meet his threshold. By the time the entree arrived, he had stopped asking Diego questions altogether and had begun, instead, addressing comments about Diego directly to me, as though Diego were not sitting 3 feet away, fully capable of hearing every word. "Sophie, you have a degree in economics," my father said, cutting into his steak without looking up. "You could work anywhere, do anything. I just want to understand the trajectory here. Where does this," he gestured vaguely in Diego's direction, "actually go?" "It goes wherever we decide it goes, Dad," I said, my face burning with a humiliation that was not my own, but that I felt on Diego's behalf, more acutely than I had ever felt anything on my own. "That's not an answer," my father said. "I built this family's name over 30 years. Your sister married a man whose family the whole city respects. I am simply asking what kind of future you're planning to build with a man who fixes transmissions for a living." Diego, to his enormous credit, did not raise his voice, did not defend himself with anger, though I could see, in the careful stillness of his jaw, exactly how much control that composure was costing him. "With respect, Mr. Bennett," he said, "I think what someone does with their hands says less about their future than what they do with their character. I work hard. I take care of the people who matter to me. I don't need anyone's permission to know that's worth something." My father set down his fork, and the silence that followed felt, to me, like the entire room had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. "Character doesn't pay a mortgage in the neighborhood my daughter grew up in," he said finally, quietly, and something in that quiet was far more damning than if he'd shouted it. "I've built this family a certain kind of life, and I intend to see it continue, not get diluted by someone who thinks changing oil is a career." My mother, who had said almost nothing through the entire exchange beyond small, tight-lipped commentary about the food, finally spoke, her voice carrying the specific, brittle brightness she used when she wanted to smooth something over without actually resolving it. "I'm sure Diego is a very nice young man," she said, in a tone that made clear she believed the opposite. "But Sophie, darling, you're only 23. There's no need to be so serious about anyone this early. Plenty of time to meet someone more suited to the life you've been raised for." Diego did not say another word for the rest of the meal, and neither did I. And when we left that house 45 minutes later, sitting in his old pickup truck in the circular driveway lined with imported maples, he turned to me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger, but something closer to a quiet, resigned sadness, the expression of a man who had, I would later understand, seen this exact evening play out before, with a different woman, years earlier, and had hoped, against his own better judgment, that it might go differently this time. "You don't have to choose anything tonight," he told me, "but I need you to know, Sophie, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life auditioning for people who've already decided I failed the test before I walked in the door. Whatever happens with your family, that part isn't going to change." I did not have an answer for him that night. It would take another year, a year of increasingly strained dinners, of my mother's pointed comments, of my father's flat refusal to acknowledge Diego's existence at family gatherings, before the choice my parents had been quietly forcing on me finally, undeniably, arrived at my door, with an ultimatum attached that would not allow for any more careful avoidance. Diego proposed to me on a Tuesday evening, 17 months after that dinner, in the most unremarkable circumstances imaginable. Not on a beach, not with a hired photographer hiding in the bushes, but in the garage itself. After closing, both of us covered in the grime of an engine rebuild we'd been working on together. Because by then I had learned enough from him to be genuinely useful with a wrench rather than just decorative company. He got down on one knee right there on the concrete floor, a ring box pulled from his coverall pocket, and told me, in the plain, unhurried way he told me everything, that he had spent his whole life believing love was something you built with your hands, patiently, the same way you rebuilt an engine that everyone else had given up on, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life building that with me. I said yes, before he'd finished the sentence. I told my parents 2 days later, sitting in the same dining room where Diego had once endured my father's interrogation, and I want to describe, as precisely as I can remember it, the exact shape of what happened next, because I have told this part of the story many times in the years since, and I have never once exaggerated it, not even slightly, because it has never needed exaggeration. My father set down his coffee cup with a deliberate, controlled care that I recognized, even then, as the calm before something enormous. "Sophie," he said, "I want you to think very carefully about what you're telling me, because I am going to say something once, and I need you to understand that I mean it exactly as I say it." I told him I understood. "If you marry that man," he said, "you are no longer my daughter. Not metaphorically, not as some dramatic expression I don't intend to follow through on. I mean it literally. Your name comes off the trust. Your name comes off any future involvement in Bennett Properties. You will not be welcome in this house, at this table, or at any family event, for as long as you remain married to him. This is not a threat, Sophie. It is a fact I am telling you in advance, so that when you make your choice, you make it with full information about its cost." My mother said nothing to soften it. She sat beside my father with her hands folded in her lap, her face composed into the same brittle brightness she'd worn at that first dinner, and when I looked to her, desperate for some flicker of maternal protectiveness to intervene, she simply said, "Your father has made himself very clear, Sophie. I hope you'll make the right decision," in a tone that made unmistakably plain which decision she considered right. I want to tell you that I made my choice instantly, in a single, clean moment of clarity and courage. The truth is messier than that. I sat in that dining room for nearly 20 minutes, my chest tight with a grief that felt, even as I was living it, like a kind of death. The death of the daughter who had spent 24 years trying and repeatedly failing to be enough for these two particular people. The death of the family I had always imagined I would eventually be fully welcomed into if I just tried a little harder, achieved a little more, disappointed them a little less. But underneath that grief, something else was also settling into place. A recognition, slow and unwelcome but undeniable, that the family offering me this ultimatum had never actually been offering me unconditional love to begin with. It had been offering me conditional belonging, contingent on my compliance, and I understood, sitting at that table, that if I chose them that day, I would spend the rest of my life understanding, with total clarity, exactly how narrow and precarious my place in this family actually was. I would know, forever, that love in this house came with a price list, and that Diego's crime had simply been failing to meet the minimum purchase requirement. "I'm marrying him," I said, and my voice, to my own surprise, did not shake. My father did not argue. He did not raise his voice or beg me to reconsider. He simply nodded once, stood up from the table and said, "Then we have nothing further to discuss," and walked out of the room, and my mother, after a long, unbearable silence, stood and followed him without another word to me. I packed the belongings I could fit into my car that same afternoon: clothes, books, the small collection of photographs I could bear to take with me. While my mother watched from an upstairs window, not coming down to help, not coming down to say goodbye. Whitney called me that evening, and I remember bracing myself for at least a sliver of solidarity from my sister. Some small acknowledgement that our parents had gone too far. Instead, she told me, in a careful, distant voice, that she understood where Mom and Dad were coming from, that I was throwing away a lot for someone I'd only known 2 years, and that she hoped, someday, I'd come to my senses before it was too late to fix things. I moved into Diego's small apartment above the garage that same week, and we were married 4 months later, in a small ceremony in his uncle Ernesto's backyard. 40 guests, folding chairs, a cake Diego's aunt had baked herself. My parents did not attend. Whitney did not attend. Not a single member of my father's or mother's extended family attended, though several sent word, through a mutual acquaintance, that they had been advised not to. I stood at that altar, in a dress I'd bought second-hand and altered myself, and married the man who had told me, on our second date, that he never wanted me to feel like I needed to audition for his love, and I understood, watching him wait for me at the end of that short backyard aisle, exactly how much larger and more honest the family I was building could be than the one I was leaving behind, even if it would take me years to fully believe it. I did not learn the true scope of what Diego owned on our wedding night, or even in the months immediately following it, though I want to be clear that the secret was never, in his telling of it later, meant to survive the wedding itself. He had planned, he told me, to tell me everything once we were married, once the ceremony had proven, in the most permanent way available to him, that I had chosen him without any knowledge of what he was actually worth. But the weeks after our small backyard wedding were consumed by the practical business of building a life together on a mechanic's income, budgeting groceries, arguing gently over whether we could afford new tires for my aging sedan, learning the small daily rhythms of two people merging their lives. And somehow, in the middle of all that ordinary, hard-won happiness, the conversation kept getting postponed. It finally happened 8 months into our marriage, on a night I remember with a clarity that has not dimmed at all in the years since. Diego came home from the garage later than usual, his face carrying an expression I had not seen on him before. Not distress exactly, but a kind of tense, focused seriousness, the look of a man who had made a decision and was bracing himself to follow through on it. He asked me to sit down at our small kitchen table, and he told me, without any preamble, that there was something he needed to show me. He opened his laptop, an old, unremarkable one, nothing that would have suggested anything beyond ordinary use, and pulled up a series of documents: incorporation papers, financial statements, an organizational chart with his name at the top of a structure I did not, at first, fully understand the size of. "This is Ironwood Capital," he said. "It's a holding company I started when I was 19. It owns 11 businesses right now, across 4 states. An auto parts distributor, 2 commercial real estate properties, a small manufacturing plant outside Denver, a handful of other things. The garage where we met is the smallest thing I own, Sophie, And it's the only one I actually run myself day to day, because it's the one I love. I stared at the screen for a long moment, at numbers that did not match, in any way, the life we had been living together. A life of careful grocery budgets and secondhand furniture and arguments over tires. How much, I finally asked, is all of this actually worth? He told me a figure that made the room tilt slightly around me, a figure well into 8 digits, and I sat there in stunned silence for what felt like a very long time before I finally asked the only question that mattered to me in that moment, underneath the shock. Why didn't you tell me? He explained Kayla to me that night, the full story rather than the fragments he'd offered before. The way she had transformed the moment she learned what he was worth. The way her love had revealed itself, in retrospect, to have been aimed at his bank account all along, rather than at him. He told me about the promise he'd made to himself afterward, the decision to never again reveal his wealth to someone until he was completely certain of their love without it. And he told me, his voice thick with something between relief and fear, that he had wanted, more than almost anything, to tell me before we married, but that some old, wounded part of him had needed to see me choose him, fully, publicly, at the cost of my entire family. Before he could fully trust that I would still be standing there once I knew. I understood, sitting at that table, why he had needed that test. I did not entirely forgive him for it, not immediately. There was a raw, uncomfortable sting in learning that I had been, in some sense, evaluated, even by a man I loved completely, even for reasons I could logically understand. I told him this honestly that night, and he did not argue with me or defend himself. He simply apologized, plainly and completely, and told me that if I needed time to be angry about it, he would give me all the time I needed, because he understood now, watching my face, exactly how much the secret had cost me in ways he hadn't fully considered when he was protecting himself from being hurt the way Kayla had hurt him. We did not fix that particular wound in a single conversation. It took months, honestly, of slowly rebuilding a kind of trust that was different from the trust I'd had in him before. A trust that now had to hold space for the fact that he was capable of withholding something enormous from me, even with good intentions, even out of real fear rather than deception. But I never once, in all the months that followed, doubted that his reasons had been genuine, or that his love for me had been real long before that laptop opened on our kitchen table. And slowly, I came to understand something else too, that the version of Diego I had fallen in love with, the patient, unhurried mechanic who explained transmission problems without condescension, had never been a performance at all. It had simply been the truest, most essential version of who he was, the version he had built his entire empire in service of protecting, rather than the version the empire itself had made him into. I asked him, that first week after the reveal, whether he ever intended to tell my parents the truth, whether some part of him wanted, as much as I sometimes privately did, to walk back into that dining room and show them exactly how wrong they had been. No, he said, without hesitation. If I ever tell them, it won't be to prove anything. It'll only be because it happens to matter for some other reason. I don't need your father's respect, Sophie. I stopped needing it the night he told you that you weren't his daughter anymore, over a man who fixes transmissions for a living. Some people, you don't chase their approval. You just let them keep being wrong about you, and you build your life somewhere they can't reach it. I did not fully understand, that night, how prophetic that sentence would turn out to be, how completely, and how unexpectedly, it would come true, nearly a decade later, in a conference room neither of us could have imagined sitting in on that quiet evening in our small kitchen. I want to tell you about the years that followed, because I think it would be easy in telling this story to skip straight from the wedding my parents boycotted to the confrontation that would eventually vindicate everything Diego and I had built together. But the years between were not simply a waiting period. They were, in every way that mattered, the actual substance of our life. The part where two people who had chosen each other completely built something neither of us could have built alone. We stayed in the apartment above the garage for the first 2 years of our marriage, not because Diego couldn't have afforded something grander, but because we had both, independently and then together, come to understand that the life we wanted was not defined by the square footage of our home. I finished my economics degree during those years, taking night classes while working days, and Diego, quietly and without any fanfare, began teaching me the fundamentals of what Ironwood Capital actually did. Not because he needed my help, but because he had discovered, in the months after revealing his wealth to me, that I had a genuine aptitude for exactly the kind of analysis his business required. The same careful, patient attention to detail that had once made me good at reconciling accounts at that small firm downtown. I joined Ironwood Capital officially 3 years into our marriage, not as a courtesy title but as an actual analyst, working my way up through genuine competence rather than nepotism, a fact Diego insisted on as firmly as I did. He made me interview with his existing team the same way any other candidate would have been evaluated. And I have always been quietly proud that the operations director who hired me, a sharp, skeptical woman named Renee Okoye, did not learn I was Diego's wife until after she'd already extended the offer. We bought our first real house 4 years into the marriage, modest by the standards of the neighborhood I'd grown up in, but genuinely ours in a way Ridgemont Lane had never felt, even as a child. We had our daughter, Isabella, the following year, and our son, Mateo, 2 years after that. And I want to tell you honestly that holding each of my children for the first time, in a hospital room with Diego beside me instead of a distant, managing presence somewhere down the hall, taught me more about what a family was actually supposed to feel like than 22 years in my parents' house ever had. My contact with my family during those years was almost non-existent. My father made good on his ultimatum with the precise, unflinching consistency I should have expected from a man who ran his business on contracts rather than sentiment. My name was removed from the family trust within a month of the wedding, and I received, in the years that followed, exactly 2 pieces of communication from him. A terse email when my grandmother died, informing me of the funeral arrangements without any expression of personal grief or invitation to grieve alongside the family, and a Christmas card, 5 years into my marriage, containing no personal note, simply a printed family photograph. My parents, Whitney, Bradley, their 2 children, that made unmistakably, wordlessly clear exactly who counted as family in that photograph and who did not. My mother reached out slightly more, though never substantially, a birthday text most years, usually arriving a day or 2 late, brief and impersonal. The kind of message you send to maintain a technicality rather than a relationship. I responded to these with equal brevity for a long time, still too raw, still too protective of the fragile new life I was building, to risk opening a door that might simply close on my fingers again the moment I reached through it. Whitney and I spoke perhaps twice a year, strained, careful calls that never quite crossed into honesty. She told me, on one of these calls, about 3 years into my marriage, that Bradley's law firm had merged with a larger practice, that their household income had roughly doubled, that they were building a new house in an even more exclusive development than the one we'd grown up in. She did not ask about Diego. She did not ask about the children I was, by then raising. Isabella had been born that same year, and Whitney did not know her niece's name until I mentioned it, unprompted, near the end of the call, and I remember the small, telling silence that followed, the silence of a sister who had simply never thought to ask. I did not spend those years angry, exactly, though there were certainly nights, especially in the early ones, when grief and anger blurred together into something I couldn't fully separate. Mostly, I spent those years building a marriage, a career, two children who would never once have to wonder whether their worth was contingent on their achievements, a version of family life defined by presence rather than performance. Diego and I built Ironwood Capital's portfolio from 11 businesses to nearly 30 over that decade, expanding, in the later years, into a specialty that Diego had discovered a genuine gift for: acquiring distressed corporate debt from companies that had overextended themselves, restructuring it fairly rather than predatorily, and, more often than the industry's reputation would suggest, helping struggling businesses survive rather than simply picking their bones clean. I did not think, during any of those years, about my father's real estate empire beyond the occasional headline I noticed in passing about Bennett Properties Group's latest development. I had, by then, built a life large enough and full enough that my parents' world had genuinely stopped occupying the center of my thoughts, the way a childhood home slowly recedes in your rearview mirror the longer and further you drive from it. I had no idea in those years that Bennett Properties Group had begun, quietly and then not so quietly, to overextend itself in exactly the same way so many of the companies Ironwood Capital acquired had overextended themselves before their own collapses. And I certainly had no idea that the collision course between my father's failing empire and my husband's careful, patient one had already, invisibly, begun. I learned the full extent of what had happened to Bennett Properties Group only in fragments, and only much later, the way you learn about a slow-motion collapse that occurred largely outside your view, through industry news, through Rene Okoye's due diligence reports, and eventually, painfully, directly from my father's own mouth. But I want to lay out the story here as clearly as I eventually came to understand it, because I think the shape of my father's downfall matters as much as the shape of my own exile. My father had spent nearly a decade riding a wave of easy credit and a booming regional real estate market, expanding Bennett Properties Group aggressively into luxury mixed-use developments, the kind of glass and steel projects with ground-floor retail and high-end residential units above that had made developers across the country enormous fortunes during the boom years. He had, by all accounts, been genuinely skilled at identifying promising sites and negotiating favorable land deals, the same instinct that had built his company's early success. What he had not been skilled at, it turned out, was recognizing when to stop. 3 years after I married Diego, my father broke ground on the largest project of his career, a sprawling luxury development called Bennett Heights, combining residential towers, a boutique hotel, and premium retail space on a 40-acre parcel he had spent nearly 2 years assembling through a series of increasingly leveraged land acquisitions. He financed the project through a combination of traditional bank loans and, more dangerously, a series of high-interest mezzanine loans from private lenders willing to take on more risk for a higher return. The same kind of financing structure that had quietly destabilized dozens of ambitious developers before him, all of whom had believed, the same way my father believed, that they were the exception rather than the rule. Bennett Heights broke ground during a period of low interest rates and strong demand. It was still under construction, roughly 60% complete, when the market shifted. Interest rates rose sharply over 18 months. Commercial lending tightened across the industry, and the luxury residential demand my father had bet the entire project on softened considerably as economic uncertainty spread through the region. Construction costs, meanwhile, continued climbing, driven by the same kind of material and labor pressures that had, in a strange and unknowing echo I would only recognize much later, also plagued an entirely different family's construction company in a different city that same period. By the time Isabella turned 3, 6 years into my marriage, Bennett Properties Group was, though I did not yet know it, servicing debt payments on Bennett Heights that consumed nearly 40% of the company's total cash flow, with construction still incomplete and pre-sale numbers on the residential units running well below the projections my father had used to secure his original financing. He had, according to the reports Renee would later compile, begun quietly refinancing older, more stable properties in the company's portfolio to generate the cash needed to keep Bennett Heights moving forward. A strategy that worked, in the narrow sense of keeping the project alive, while systematically hollowing out the financial foundation of everything else my father had spent 30 years building. I want to be honest that I did not track any of this in real time. I learned about Bennett Heights' existence the same way most people in the region did. A splashy announcement in the business section, my father quoted describing it as the crown jewel of Bennett Properties' legacy. A phrase that struck me, when I read it, as carrying an unintentional irony that would only become clear years later. I did not think about the project again for a long time, occupied as I was with my own growing family and my own growing role at Ironwood Capital. It was Whitney, during one of our strained biannual phone calls, who first mentioned, carefully and almost in passing, that things had been tense at Bennett Properties lately, that Dad had been under a lot of pressure, that Mom had mentioned some cash flow issues over a family dinner Whitney had attended and I, of course, had not. I remember feeling at the time a distant, complicated flicker of concern, not for my father specifically, whose ultimatum I had never fully stopped carrying somewhere in my chest, but for the broader, harder-to-name reality of watching a family, even an estranged one, show the first signs of real trouble. I did not reach out. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be easy to tell this story as though I spent those years quietly monitoring my parents' decline, waiting for my moment. I did not. I had built a life, by then, that required my full attention, and some old, careful part of me still understood, correctly as it would turn out, that reaching toward my parents uninvited would accomplish nothing except reopening a wound that had only just begun, slowly and imperfectly, to close. What I did not know, what I could not have known, sitting in my own comfortable, hard-won life 4 years before the reckoning finally arrived, was that Bennett Properties Group's mezzanine debt, the high-interest loans that had been quietly consuming the company's cash flow for years, had recently been bundled and sold, the way distressed debt often is, to a specialty acquisition fund that bought exactly this kind of overextended obligation from lenders eager to offload risk before a project's fate became fully clear. That fund was a subsidiary of Ironwood Capital. I found out by accident, the way most enormous things in this story seem to have arrived, not through some dramatic investigation, but through the ordinary machinery of my own job. I had been promoted, by then, to Director of Acquisitions at Ironwood Capital's Distressed Debt Division, a role that put me directly in charge of reviewing the due diligence files on every debt package the company considered purchasing. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unremarkable in every way until it wasn't, when Renee Okoye dropped a thick acquisition file on my desk as part of a routine batch review. 6 separate mezzanine debt positions the fund was considering purchasing from a consortium of private lenders looking to offload risk ahead of a projected market downturn. I worked through the files methodically, the way I always did, reading each borrower's financial statements, project details, and repayment history with the same careful attention Diego had taught me years earlier at our kitchen table. I was 3 files in when I turned the page and saw, printed in the plain, unremarkable font of a standard loan document, the name Bennett Properties Group, LLC. I sat very still for a long moment. I want to describe, as precisely as I can, exactly what that moment felt like, because I have never quite found language sufficient to it. A strange, vertiginous collision of two entirely separate lives I had spent nearly a decade keeping carefully apart, suddenly, without any warning, occupying the exact same file folder. I read through the entire debt position twice, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, given what I was reading. The numbers were worse than Whitney's vague, careful phrasing had suggested. Bennett Properties Group was carrying nearly $31 million in high-interest mezzanine debt across two separate loans, both secured against the still unfinished Bennett Heights development, both now more than 90 days delinquent on interest payments, a fact that gave the debt holder, whoever eventually purchased this position, significant leverage over the terms of any future restructuring, up to and including the right to force a sale of the underlying collateral if payments were not brought current within a specified cure period. I brought the file to Diego that evening after the children were asleep, and I remember his face as he read through it. The same careful, focused stillness he brought to every serious decision, though I could see, underneath it, a flicker of something else. Something I recognized because I felt it too. The specific, complicated vertigo of watching two separate worlds, suddenly, unavoidably, merge into one. "We don't have to pursue this one," he said when he finished reading. "There are other debt packages in that batch. We can pass on this position entirely and let another fund pick it up. Nobody would ever have to know we saw it." I thought about that option seriously for several days, turning it over from every angle I could imagine. Part of me was deeply tempted by it, the clean, simple relief of simply looking away, letting my father's company find its own way through this crisis or fail on its own terms, without my involvement ever entering the equation at all. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that walking away would not actually be neutral. If Ironwood Capital passed on the position, another fund, one with none of the patient, fair restructuring philosophy Diego had built his entire debt acquisition strategy around, would almost certainly purchase it instead, and would have every incentive to push Bennett Properties Group toward the fastest, most aggressive resolution available, up to and including forcing liquidation of the unfinished Bennett Heights project at exactly the moment its value was most depressed, a move that would not only destroy my father's company, but would very likely cost hundreds of construction workers, contractors, and eventual employees their livelihoods in the process. People who had nothing to do with my father's ultimatum, nothing to do with the family dinner that ended with me packing my car in an afternoon. "I want to acquire it," I told Diego, several nights after first seeing the file. "Not to punish him. I've thought about that instinct honestly, and I don't think it's what's driving me anymore. Even though I won't pretend some old, wounded part of me doesn't feel something complicated about the timing of all this. I want to acquire it because I understand this kind of debt structure better than almost anyone, because I know exactly how to restructure it fairly instead of predatorily, and because there are real people whose jobs depend on Bennett Heights getting finished properly instead of gutted for parts by someone who doesn't care whether it survives." Diego was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the same careful attention he'd once used to explain a transmission problem to a stranger who'd broken down in a parking lot. "And your father?" he said finally. "Are you ready for what it means when he finds out who's holding his company's future?" I did not have a complete answer to that question yet, but I told him the truth, which was that I was ready to find out, one way or another, because I was done letting the possibility of my father's reaction dictate the shape of my own choices. A lesson, I realized as I said it out loud, that I had actually first learned from Diego himself, 9 years earlier, in a dining room on Ridgemont Lane, when he told my father that character was worth something, and meant it, regardless of whether my father was ever capable of hearing it. Ironwood Capital acquired the mezzanine debt position on Bennett Heights 3 weeks later, structured through a specialty acquisition subsidiary called Ironcrest Holdings, a name chosen, deliberately, to reveal nothing about its parent company to anyone conducting only a surface-level search. My father would not learn who actually controlled his company's future for another 4 months. 4 months during which I would come to understand, with growing clarity, exactly what kind of reckoning was quietly assembling itself, one careful, deliberate step at a time. For the first 4 months after Ironcrest Holdings acquired the debt position, I ran point on the restructuring negotiations myself, communicating exclusively through Renee and a small team of attorneys. My own name kept entirely off every piece of correspondence that reached Bennett Properties Group or its counsel. I want to explain how unusual this was, professionally, because I think it matters to understanding exactly how deliberately I structured this. Directors of acquisitions did not typically handle the granular, day-to-day negotiation work on a restructuring. That was normally delegated to a workout specialist. I insisted on this position personally, telling Renee only that the borrower was a company I had a personal history with, which was, I think, the understatement of my professional life. Those 4 months taught me things about my father's business, and by extension about my father himself, that I had never had access to before. I read every financial disclosure Bennett Properties Group was required to provide as part of the restructuring process, and I watched, through the careful, bloodless language of quarterly reports and cash flow statements, a portrait emerge of a company E and a man. Under a kind of pressure I had genuinely not understood from the outside. My father's initial response to the restructuring notice, delivered through his longtime attorney, was aggressive and defensive, the tone of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in every room he entered, unaccustomed to negotiating from a position of genuine vulnerability. His attorney's first letter characterized the 90-day payment delinquency as a temporary cash flow timing issue, and requested, rather than proposed, a 90-day forbearance with no change to the underlying loan terms, a request that, having reviewed the actual numbers, I understood immediately was not remotely sufficient to address the structural problem underneath it. I rejected that initial proposal, through counsel, and countered with a term sheet that Ironcrest Holdings attorneys presented as standard restructuring practice, though I had, in fact, designed every element of it myself, late at night after the children were asleep, drawing on everything Diego had taught me about restructuring debt in a way that gave struggling businesses a genuine path to survival, rather than simply extracting maximum value before collapse. The terms extended the loan maturity by 4 years, reduced the interest rate by nearly half, and converted a portion of the debt into a preferred equity position in Bennett Heights itself, meaning Ironcrest Holdings would share in the project's eventual success, rather than simply collecting interest on its way to a potential default, an arrangement that gave my father genuine incentive alignment with the very lender he'd spent the negotiation assuming was simply trying to extract everything possible before pulling out. My father's attorney, over the following weeks, grew increasingly baffled. I learned this later, from Renee, who fielded most of the direct calls, by the unusual generosity of the terms, repeatedly asking what Ironcrest Holdings' actual angle was, unable to reconcile such favorable restructuring terms with the aggressive, predatory reputation distressed debt funds typically carried in the industry. Renee, following my explicit instructions, simply told him that Ironcrest's leadership believed in structuring deals that let good projects survive rather than harvesting them for parts, a philosophy that was, I want to be clear, genuinely true of Diego's approach. I was not inventing a cover story so much as applying, with unusual personal motivation, the exact framework Ironwood Capital had built its entire distressed debt reputation on for years. I did not enjoy those 4 months in the simple, uncomplicated way I might have imagined, years earlier, that some hypothetical reckoning with my father's business might feel. I found myself, instead, in the strange position of quietly, invisibly protecting a company built by a man who had told me, in plain and deliberate language, that I was no longer his daughter. Protecting it not for his sake, but for the 400 and some construction workers, contractors, and future tenants whose livelihoods depended on Bennett Heights surviving, and, if I am fully honest, for some small, complicated part of myself that still, after everything, did not want to watch my father's legacy collapse entirely, even as I understood exactly how little that legacy had ever made room for me. The restructuring agreement was finalized and ready for signature in the 5th month, and it was only then, as the deal moved from Ironcrest's legal team to the final closing documentation, that the structural reality of the transaction required something that could no longer be avoided: a closing meeting, in person, with representatives of both parties, to execute the final paperwork and formally establish the new ownership and equity structure of Bennett Heights going forward. I had known, from the beginning, that this moment would eventually arrive. I had simply not fully prepared myself for how strange it would feel, sitting in my office the week before that meeting, choosing which version of myself would walk into that conference room: the daughter my father had disowned 9 years earlier, or the director of acquisitions whose signature, alongside Diego's, now controlled the fate of everything my father had spent his entire life building. I decided, in the end, that I did not have to choose between those two versions of myself at all. I could simply walk in as exactly who I had actually become, both of them, at once, for the first time in 9 years standing in the same room, refusing any longer to be kept separate. The closing meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning on a Thursday, in a conference room at my father's own attorney's office, a detail I found, in retrospect, quietly fitting, since it meant I would be walking, for the first time in 9 years, into a room filled with people who had known me as Gerald Bennett's younger daughter long before they ever heard the name Cruz attached to anything. Diego offered to come with me. I told him I needed to do this part alone, at least the first few minutes of it, though I asked him to be reachable by phone and, if things went the way I suspected they might, to be ready to join partway through. He understood, the way he always understood the things that mattered to me without requiring lengthy explanation, and he kissed me at the door that morning and told me, simply, "Whatever happens in that room, you already won the only thing that actually matters. Everything else is just paperwork." A sentence that landed with a strange, specific familiarity I could not place until much later, when I remembered Salvatore's words to a different woman in a different story I would not hear for several more years. I walked into that conference room at 9:58, 2 minutes early, dressed in a tailored suit that had nothing in common with the second-hand wedding dress I'd worn 9 years before, and I watched the room's composition shift in real time as people registered who had actually arrived. My father was seated at the head of the table, flanked by his longtime attorney and a younger associate I didn't recognize, his hair grayer than I remembered, his face carrying new lines that told a story of years I hadn't been present for. He looked up as I entered, and for a long moment, his expression registered only confusion. A familiar, well-dressed woman walking into a meeting he had every reason to expect would be attended by strangers, his mind visibly working to place me in a context that made sense. "Sophie?" he said, finally, his voice carrying an uncertainty I had genuinely never heard from him before. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here representing Ironcrest Holdings," I said, taking the seat directly across from him that had been set aside for the acquiring party's lead representative, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect it to be. "I'm the director of acquisitions who structured this restructuring agreement, Dad. I've been the one on the other side of this negotiation for the last 5 months." The silence that followed was total. I watched my father's attorney's face shift through several stages of recalculation, watched the younger associate glance nervously between my father and me, trying to understand what he had just walked into. My father himself simply stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the particular stunned stillness of a man whose entire understanding of a situation had just been dismantled in a single sentence. "That's not possible," he finally said. "Ironcrest Holdings is a subsidiary of Ironwood Capital. I had my team research the parent company months ago. It's owned by—" He stopped, and I watched, with something between satisfaction and grief, the exact moment the final piece connected in his mind. "Cruz," he said quietly. "Ironwood Capital. That's him. That's the mechanic." "His name is Diego," I said. "And yes, Ironwood Capital is his company. Has been since he was 19 years old, long before either of us ever knew you existed, Dad. He owns 31 businesses now. Ironcrest is one of his acquisition subsidiaries. Your company's entire future right now is in the hands of the man you told me I couldn't marry because he fixed transmissions for a living." My father sat back in his chair slowly, and I watched something move across his face that I had genuinely never seen there before in 33 years of knowing him. Not anger, not the cold, controlled disapproval I remembered from the dining room on Ridgemont Lane, but something closer to a kind of dazed, disoriented grief. The specific grief of a man realizing all at once that the entire framework he had used to judge the world had been catastrophically, expensively wrong. "He never told anyone," my father said, almost to himself. "All those years. He let us think. He let everyone think he was just a mechanic," I finished. "Yes. Because that's genuinely who he is, Dad. He still runs that garage himself 3 days a week. He built everything else because he had a talent for it, not because he needed you or anyone else to be impressed by it. You spent one dinner deciding exactly what he was worth, and you were wrong about every single part of it. And I've spent 9 years watching you be wrong about it while you told the rest of the family I'd thrown my life away." My father's attorney cleared his throat, visibly attempting to steer the meeting back toward its original purpose. "Perhaps we should proceed with reviewing the closing documents," he said carefully, and I nodded, because I had not come into that room to relitigate 9 years of grievance in front of a room full of attorneys, however satisfying some old, wounded part of me found the opening minutes. But before we moved forward, my father said one more thing, quietly, in a voice I had never heard him use before, not the commanding, certain voice of the man who had delivered an ultimatum across a dining room table, but something smaller, more uncertain. The voice, I realized, of a man genuinely afraid for the first time in longer than I could remember. "Is he going to take everything?" my father asked. "Is that why you're here? To make sure of it personally?" I looked at him for a long moment, at the fear underneath the question, and I felt something in my chest that surprised me, not triumph, though I want to be honest that some part of that first hour did carry a grim, complicated satisfaction I am not ashamed of. What I felt, mostly, looking at my father in that moment, was something closer to the exhausted, clear-eyed compassion you feel for someone who spent their whole life building an entire identity around being right about people, and was now, for the first time, being forced to confront exactly how much that certainty had cost him. "No," I said. "I'm here because the terms on the table are the fairest ones your company is going to find anywhere in this industry, And because I understand this restructuring better than anyone else at Ironwood Capital, and because 400 people are counting on Bennett Heights actually getting finished. I'm not here to take anything from you, Dad. I'm here because, unlike you, I don't actually believe people's worth is something you get to calculate and then discard. I watched that sentence land, and I watched my father, for the first time in my entire life, have absolutely nothing to say in response. I called Diego during the mid-meeting recess, standing alone in the hallway outside the conference room while the attorneys reviewed the final documentation language, and told him it was time. He arrived 20 minutes later, and I want to describe the specific quality of the silence that fell over that conference room when he walked through the door. Not the tense, uncertain silence that had greeted my own arrival, but something heavier, more absolute. The silence of a room full of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the man standing in the doorway. He wore a suit, not because he needed to prove anything, but because it was, he told me later, simply appropriate for a closing meeting of this size. The same practical instinct that had once led him to quote me an honest repair estimate instead of an inflated one. He looked, I thought, watching my father's face as he took in the sight of him, exactly like himself. The same steady, unhurried presence, the same direct, unflinching eye contact. And I understood, in that moment, that this was precisely the point. Diego had never needed to become someone else to deserve the respect this room was now, belatedly, extending to him. He had simply needed the room to finally see him clearly. "Mr. Bennett," Diego said, extending his hand the same way he had 9 years earlier across a dining room table, with the same firm, direct grip, the same steady eye contact. "It's been a long time." My father shook his hand slowly, and I watched him search Diego's face for some trace of triumph, some flicker of the vindication I think he expected, even feared, that a man in Diego's position would be entitled to. He did not find it, because it was not there. Diego had never built Ironwood Capital to prove anything to my father. He had built it, patiently, over 15 years, because he was extraordinarily good at seeing value where other people saw only what was easy to dismiss. The same gift, I understood watching that handshake, that had once seen worth in a broken-down college student in a strip mall parking lot, long before he understood anything about her family's name. "I owe you an explanation," my father said, and I watched the words cost him something visible, a man unaccustomed to explaining himself to anyone. "9 years ago, I judged you by the only measure I understood how to use. I was wrong about what you were capable of. I don't know if that matters to you at this point, but I wanted to say it." "It matters," Diego said, and his voice, when he continued, carried none of the coldness I might have expected, none of the satisfaction I might, if I'm honest, have wanted him to feel entitled to. "But I want to be clear about something, Mr. Bennett, because I think it's important you understand it correctly. I'm not here today because I finally became something you'd approve of. I was worth exactly the same thing 9 years ago that I'm worth today. The businesses just make it easier for people like you to see it now. The measure you used back then was always the wrong one. It just took you 9 years and $31 million of debt to find that out." My father absorbed that, quietly, and did not argue with it, which I understood, watching him, as its own kind of concession. The closest thing to an admission of total defeat that a man like my father was capable of offering in a room full of his own attorneys. We proceeded, after that, with the closing itself, a process that took another 2 hours, methodical and largely unremarkable in the way that even the largest financial transactions ultimately are, reduced to signatures and initials and the quiet, procedural language of attorneys, confirming that each party understood exactly what they were agreeing to. My father signed the restructuring agreement without further negotiation, his hand, I noticed, slightly unsteady on the pen, and when the final signature page was notarized and the deal was, formally and irreversibly, complete, he sat back in his chair and looked, for a long moment, not at Diego, but at me. "I don't know how to ask you to forgive me," he said quietly, once the attorneys had begun gathering their papers and the room's formal business had concluded. "I'm not sure I even know how to ask for it in a way that wouldn't sound like I'm only doing it now because I need something from you." "You're not wrong that the timing is complicated," I told him, honestly. "I've thought about that a lot over the last 5 months. But I didn't structure this deal to force an apology out of you, Dad. I structured it because it was the right way to handle a distressed debt position, and because I understand what happens to a project like Bennett Heights when a company gets that overextended, and because I didn't want 400 people to lose their jobs over your mistakes any more than I wanted them to lose their jobs over mine, if our positions had somehow been reversed. Whatever happens between us personally, from here, that's a separate conversation, and it's one I'm willing to have, eventually, if you're actually willing to have it honestly. But I'm not going to have it today, in a conference room, 5 minutes after you signed a restructuring agreement you needed to sign anyway." My father nodded slowly, and something in his face, the same face that had once told me, with total certainty, that I was no longer his daughter, looked, for the first time in my entire life, genuinely uncertain of its own ground. "Okay," he said. "Whenever you're ready, I'll be ready too." I did not know, walking out of that conference room with Diego's hand in mine, whether that particular door would ever actually open the way my father seemed, in that moment, to be hoping it might. But I understood, for the first time in 9 years, that the choice of whether to open it now belonged entirely to me, on my own timeline, without any ultimatum attached to it at all. And that understanding, more than any restructuring agreement, more than any $31 million of debt, felt like the truest victory of that entire long, complicated morning. My mother called me that same evening, and I almost didn't answer, uncertain whether I had the emotional reserves left, after that conference room, for whatever version of the conversation she was about to bring. I answered anyway, because some part of me was curious, after 9 years of careful distance, what she would actually choose to say when the pretense that had structured our entire relationship had just, publicly and irreversibly, collapsed. "Your father told me what happened," she said, without preamble, her voice tight in a way I recognized from childhood as the particular register she used when she was working hard to control an emotion she didn't want to name directly. "Sophie, why didn't you tell us? All these years, you could have told us who he really was?" I sat with that question for a long moment, feeling something sharpen in my chest that I hadn't fully expected. "Tell you what exactly, Mom?" I said. "That my husband was secretly worth enough money to finally meet your standards? Is that what you're asking me? Why I didn't rush back to Ridgemont Lane the moment I found out, so you could stop being embarrassed about the man I married?" "That's not fair," she said, though her voice wavered as she said it, the wavering of someone who suspected, even as she objected, that it might actually be entirely fair. "It is fair, Mom," I said, "because that's exactly the question you're asking. You're not asking why I didn't tell you because you missed me. You're asking why I let you keep believing something that turned out to be embarrassing to you in hindsight. I didn't owe either of you an explanation of Diego's finances. I owed you nothing at all, actually, after the two of you told me I wasn't your daughter anymore, over a dinner where you barely spoke a single word in my defense." There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed. Smaller, less composed, closer to something genuine than I think I'd heard from my mother in longer than I could remember. "I let your father make that decision," she said. "That night, and every day after it. I told myself I was being loyal to my marriage, keeping the peace, not undermining him in front of you. But the truth is, Sophie, I was relieved. I didn't have to be the one who said it, but I agreed with him, and I let him say it for both of us. And then I got to feel like I hadn't really done it myself. I've had 9 years to sit with that, and I don't think I ever fully let myself look at it honestly until today, when your father called me from that meeting sounding like a man who'd just found out the ground he'd been standing on his whole life wasn't actually solid. I did not expect that honesty from her. I want to be clear that it did not immediately dissolve 9 years of hurt, did not undo the birthday texts that arrived a day late, the Christmas card with no personal note, the years of Whitney's children growing up as strangers to me while my own children grew up unknown to their grandmother. But it was, I recognized, the first completely honest thing my mother had said to me since the night Diego proposed, and I found myself, despite everything, genuinely moved by it. I have 2 children you've never met, I told her, my own voice unsteady now. Isabella is 7. Mateo is 5. They don't know they have a grandmother named Vivian. I didn't keep them from you to punish you, Mom. I kept them from you because I wasn't willing to let them learn, the way I learned, that love in this family comes with conditions attached. If you actually want to be part of their lives, it's going to require more than a phone call the same day your husband's company nearly collapsed. It's going to require you actually showing up, consistently, without an agenda, for as long as it takes me to believe it's real. I understand, she said, and for the first time in the entire conversation, I believed her completely. I don't expect it to happen quickly, Sophie. I don't think I've earned quickly, but I would like the chance to try if you're willing to let me. I told her I would think about it, which was the truth, and we hung up not fully reconciled, not even close, but with something new sitting between us that had not existed 9 years earlier. The beginning, however fragile, of an actual conversation, rather than the careful performance we had both been maintaining in its place. I want to include one more detail my mother shared with me, several months after that first honest phone call, because it adds a piece to her side of the story that I think deserves space here. She told me, on a visit to our house nearly a year after the conference room, that she had written me letters during the years of estrangement. Not one, but several, over the course of nearly a decade, sitting down some quiet afternoon when guilt or loneliness or simply missing me became too heavy to carry silently, drafting pages she never sent. She kept them, she told me, in a small wooden box in her closet, and she asked, hesitantly, whether I would want to see them someday, or whether that would only reopen wounds better left closed. I told her I wanted to see them, and she brought the box on her next visit. 7 letters in total, spanning nearly the entire length of our estrangement, the earliest dated less than a year after I'd packed my car and driven away. The most recent dated only weeks before my father's phone call about the restructuring first reached me. I read them alone, one evening after Diego had put the children to bed, and I want to tell you honestly that they did not erase anything, did not undo a single year of silence or a single missed birthday. But they told a story I had not fully understood before. A mother who had, in fact, missed me acutely and continuously throughout those years, who had drafted apology after apology, who had come, in the 4th letter, dated roughly 5 years into the estrangement, achingly close to actually mailing it, only to tear it up, according to a small note scrawled formed unity I remembered so well from my childhood. The unity that had never once made room for honesty when honesty threatened to disrupt it. The final letter, the one dated only weeks before the restructuring, was different from the others, shorter, more direct, written, I understood reading it, in a moment of genuine crisis, as Bennett Properties Group's troubles were becoming impossible to ignore, even from the careful distance my mother had always maintained from the company's finances. It read, in part, that she had spent the previous night unable to sleep, turning over what would happen if everything my father had built collapsed and she died still a stranger to her own daughter, still unforgiven for a silence she had chosen every single day for a decade, one quiet, cowardly decision at a time. I asked her, holding that final letter, why she had never sent any of them, even the ones that came so close. Because I was more afraid of your rejection than I was of my own guilt, she told me, honestly, in a way I had never once heard from her before that year. I told myself sending them would be selfish, that I'd only be doing it to relieve my own conscience, and that you deserved better than a letter that mostly served me. But I think the truth is simpler and less noble than that, Sophie. I think I was just a coward. I think it was easier to carry the guilt privately than to risk finding out for certain that you'd already stopped wanting anything from me at all. I did not tell her the letters fixed everything, because they did not, and I have learned, across this entire story, not to offer comfort that isn't fully honest. But I told her that reading them changed something important in how I understood those 9 years, not as a period of simple, uncomplicated abandonment, but as a more complicated, more human failure, one my mother had actually grieved the whole time, even while she continued, every single day, choosing silence over the harder, riskier work of reaching out. I keep those 7 letters now, in a drawer in my own house, alongside the photograph my father gave me of the two of us at that long-forgotten summer festival. I do not read them often, but I know they are there, and I think, more than almost anything else in this story, they taught me the most important lesson about how estrangement actually works inside a family, that it is rarely as simple as one side not caring. Sometimes it is two people who both care enormously, trapped on opposite sides of a silence neither one knows how to be the first to break, each one waiting, quietly and for far too long, for the other to make the first impossible move. Whitney's reaction, when it finally came a week later, surprised me more than either of my parents had, because it arrived not as an apology or a negotiation, but as something closer to grief. She called me on a Sunday afternoon, and I could hear, immediately, that she had been crying. "I looked him up," she said, without any greeting at all. "Diego. Ironwood Capital. I spent the last week reading everything I could find. Sophie. He's been featured in 3 different business publications. He gave a keynote at an industry conference 2 years ago about ethical debt restructuring. There's a whole profile about the scholarship program he funds for kids who age out of foster care because of his own background. How did I not know any of this? How did I let 9 years go by without knowing anything real about the man my sister married?" "Because you never asked," I said as gently as I could manage, though the words still carried an edge I didn't try to fully soften. "Not once, Whitney, in 9 years. You asked about Bradley's promotion. You asked about your new house. You never once asked me a single real question about my life, because you'd already decided, the same night Dad did, that whatever I'd chosen wasn't worth asking about." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something rawer than I'd heard from her since we were children. "I think I was jealous," she said, finally, the admission clearly costing her something significant. "Not of the money. I didn't know about the money. I think I was jealous that you chose something real, even when it cost you everything, and I married exactly what Mom and Dad wanted, and told myself for years that I was happy about it. And some part of me has always known that if I let myself really look at your life, I'd have to admit I've spent 9 years performing mine instead of actually living it." I did not have a clean, comforting response to that, because I recognized, in her words, an echo of something Diego had said to me once, years earlier, about Kayla. The specific, quiet tragedy of building a life around what other people expected of you, and slowly, gradually, losing track of whether any of it was actually yours. I'm not asking you to blow up your life, Whitney, I told her. I'm asking you to actually show up in mine if you want to be part of it. My kids have an aunt they've never met. That's something we could fix, if you actually want to. We have not fully rebuilt what we lost in those 9 years. I don't think either of us expects that we ever fully will, and I have made a kind of peace with that particular limitation. But Whitney has visited 3 times in the months since that phone call, and last month, she brought her own children to meet Isabella and Mateo for the first time, and I watched my niece and nephew, cousins who had been strangers their entire lives, disappear together into the backyard within minutes, laughing over some game they'd invented on the spot, uncomplicated by any of the history that had kept their mothers apart for nearly a decade. I stood at the kitchen window watching them, and I felt something in my chest that I have come to recognize, in the months since that conference room, as the particular, complicated shape of healing. Not a clean, total resolution, but a slow, patient reconstruction, built one honest conversation at a time, on a foundation that finally, for the first time in my entire life, did not depend on my performing anything at all. I want to pause here and tell you something about my father that I did not fully understand until years into my marriage, something that does not excuse what he did to me, but that helped me, eventually, understand where it came from. Because I have learned, in the years since Meadow Ridge-style estrangements like mine happen more often than anyone wants to admit, that cruelty rarely arrives from nowhere. It is almost always inherited, passed down through a family the same way a business or a house might be, each generation absorbing it a little differently, but rarely escaping it entirely without deliberate, painful effort. My grandfather, Harold Bennett, the man who built the original strip mall that became the seed of Bennett Properties Group, had been, by every account I ever heard from relatives who knew him, an even harder man than my father. A man who had disowned his own younger brother for marrying a woman from what Harold considered the wrong background. A rupture so complete that I did not learn I had a great uncle at all until I was nearly 30 years old. When a distant cousin mentioned him in passing at a funeral neither of my parents had wanted me to attend. My father grew up, in other words, inside a family that had already perfected the exact mechanism he would later use on me. The calculated, transactional withdrawal of belonging as a tool for enforcing conformity, delivered with the same cold, unshakable certainty Harold Bennett had once used on his own brother. I do not think my father ever consciously decided to repeat that pattern. I think more likely he simply never encountered a version of family that operated any other way, and so when his own daughter chose a path he didn't approve of, he reached, instinctively, for the only tool he'd ever seen modeled, the same tool that had once been used against a great-uncle he probably never fully mourned, because mourning him would have required admitting that Harold's cruelty had cost the family something real. I learned all of this slowly, in the months after that conference room, through a series of careful, sometimes painful conversations with my father that began, tentatively, about 4 months after the closing meeting, when he called and asked, without any business pretext this time, whether I would be willing to meet him for coffee. Just the two of us. No attorneys. No restructuring documents. I said yes, cautiously, and we met at a small cafe near my office, and I watched my father, a man I had spent my entire childhood watching command every room he entered, sit across from me looking smaller than I had ever seen him, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands before he finally spoke. "I've been thinking about my own father a lot since that meeting," he said. "About Uncle Samuel. I only met him twice, you know, before he died. Both times in secret because my father would have been furious if he'd known I'd gone. I remember him as kind. Genuinely kind, in a way my father never really was. And I remember thinking, even as a kid, that something about the way my father talked about him didn't add up, that Samuel didn't sound like someone who deserved to be erased from a family, no matter what he'd done. But I never said that out loud. Not once. Not to my father. Not to anyone. I just absorbed the lesson underneath it instead. That love in this family was something you could lose completely, in an instant, if you stepped too far outside the lines. And then I grew up, and I had daughters, and somewhere along the way, without ever really deciding to, I became exactly the man who taught me that lesson in the first place. I did not offer him easy forgiveness in that conversation, because I did not feel it yet, and I have learned not to perform feelings I have not actually arrived at honestly. But I told him, honestly, that I understood, for the first time, the shape of where his cruelty had come from, and that understanding the shape of something does not require excusing it, but it does make it possible, eventually, to imagine a different relationship with the person who carried it. I don't want Isabella and Matteo to ever learn that lesson, I told him. Not from me, and not from you, if you're going to be part of their lives. If you want to know your grandchildren, Dad, it has to start from an entirely different foundation than the one you built with me. No conditions, no ultimatums, no tallying up whether their choices someday meet some standard you've decided matters more than they do. I want to learn how to do that, he said quietly. I don't know if I'm capable of it yet, but I want to learn, if you'll let me try. I have watched him try in the months since, imperfectly, haltingly, occasionally slipping back into old patterns of control that I have learned to name and correct immediately rather than absorb quietly the way I once did as a child. He is not, 9 months after that conference room, a transformed man. But he is, for the first time in my entire life, a man actively working against the only inheritance he ever knew how to pass down, and I have come to believe that the effort itself, however imperfect, is worth something real. I want to tell you about Diego's uncle Ernesto, because I think his story explains something essential about the man I married that I have not yet fully described, and because it matters to understanding why Diego built the life he built the way he built it. Ernesto Cruz took Diego in when Diego was 9 years old, after a highway accident killed both of Diego's parents on a rain-slicked road outside the small town where the family had lived for 3 generations. Ernesto was 34 at the time, unmarried, running the same small garage his own father had built, and he had never planned to raise a child. He did it anyway, without hesitation, because family, in the world Ernesto had been raised in, was not a calculation you performed before deciding whether someone deserved your loyalty. It was simply a fact you acted on. The ironwood tree that would eventually give Diego's holding company its name was planted the same week Ernesto brought Diego home. A small, unremarkable sapling that Ernesto's own mother had given him, telling him, according to the story Diego heard many times growing up, that ironwood trees grow slowly, sometimes taking decades to reach their full height, but that once grown, their wood is so dense it barely floats in water, and so strong it has been used for centuries to build things meant to outlast almost everything around them. She told him it was a tree for raising a boy who'd lost everything, Diego told me once, early in our relationship, before I understood anything about the empire that tree's name would eventually represent. Slow, solid, built to last longer than the easy things around it. Ernesto taught Diego the trade the same patient way he had learned it from his own father, not rushing him, not pressuring him toward any particular future, simply modeling, day after day in that small garage, a kind of quiet, unglamorous integrity that Diego absorbed so completely he never fully realized, until much later, how unusual it actually was. Ernesto never remarried, never had children of his own beyond Diego, and poured everything he had, his time, his patience, the entirety of a modest but hard-won income, into raising a nephew who had lost his entire world at 9 years old, without once suggesting that this sacrifice made Diego a burden rather than simply, uncomplicatedly, family. Ernesto is 71 years old now, semi-retired but still coming into the original garage 2 mornings a week. Because a man needs somewhere to put his hands, as he puts it, and he remains, alongside Diego, one of the 2 people I love most fiercely in the entire world outside my own children. He walked Diego down the aisle at our wedding, standing in for the father Diego never got to grow up with, and he cried, openly and without embarrassment, through the entire ceremony, and I remember thinking, watching him, that I had never once, in 22 years in my parents' house, seen either of my own parents weep with unguarded joy at anything. Diego built the scholarship program Whitney mentioned discovering, full trade school and community college tuition for young people aging out of foster care, named, quietly, the Ernesto Cruz Foundation. The same year, Ironwood Capital crossed its first $100 million in managed assets, because he understood, more intimately than almost anyone I have ever known, exactly what a single person's unconditional commitment can mean to a child who has lost everything else. The foundation has funded over 400 young people's educations in the years since, and Ernesto himself still reviews every single application personally, insisting, despite Diego's gentle protests, that he could hire someone for the administrative work, that the boy who raised me deserves better than a stranger reading his story. I tell you about Ernesto because I think he is the actual answer to the question my father asked in that conference room, the question underneath all his questions. How did a mechanic build an empire, and why did he keep it hidden? The answer is that Diego was never building an empire in the way my father understood empires, as monuments to status and control. He was simply extending, outward into the world, the exact same unconditional, patient, uncalculating love that Ernesto had once extended to a 9-year-old boy who had lost everything. And he had learned, from the very beginning, that this kind of love never needs an audience to be real. My parents met Isabella and Mateo for the first time 5 months after that conference room, on a carefully arranged Saturday afternoon that I had negotiated with the same deliberate caution I once brought to reviewing a distressed debt file. Small increments, clear boundaries, nothing rushed. I want to be honest that I spent the days leading up to that visit more nervous than I had been walking into the closing meeting itself, because the stakes, in a strange way, felt higher. A business deal, however personally complicated, was still ultimately a matter of numbers and terms I understood how to negotiate. My children meeting the grandparents who had spent their entire lives so far not existing to them was something else entirely. Something I could not fully control the outcome of no matter how carefully I structured the boundaries around it. My parents arrived at our house, the second larger home Diego and I had bought 2 years earlier, comfortable but nowhere close to the scale of Ridgemont Lane, carrying gifts that were, I noticed immediately, carefully, deliberately modest. A set of children's books for Isabella, a small toy garage set for Mateo that made Diego laugh out loud when he saw it. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from him around my father in longer than either of us could remember. Isabella, 7 years old and possessed of her father's same direct, unhurried curiosity, studied my mother for a long moment before asking, with the blunt honesty only children are capable of, "Are you the grandma we never met before?" I watched my mother's composure crack, just slightly, at the question. The same composure she had maintained through decades of country club luncheons and charity galas, cracking in front of a 7-year-old who had simply asked the truest question in the room. Yes, my mother said, kneeling down to Isabella's height, something I had genuinely never once seen her do for me as a child. I'm sorry it took so long, sweetheart. That was a mistake grown-ups made, not anything you or your mom did wrong. It was, I realized, listening to her say it, the single clearest, most direct apology I had ever heard my mother offer anyone, delivered not to me, where pride and history complicated every word, but to my daughter, where she had, apparently, finally found the plain language she'd never managed with me. The visit lasted 3 hours, longer than I had originally planned, and I watched, throughout the afternoon, a version of my parents I had genuinely never encountered growing up. My father sitting on the floor of Mateo's room, patiently helping him build something out of blocks with the same careful attention I remembered him giving, decades earlier, to blueprints and business plans. My mother in the kitchen with Isabella, teaching her to make the same lemon cookies my mother's own mother had once taught her, a small domestic ritual I had somehow never once been included in as a child, though Whitney, I would later learn, had. I stood in the doorway at one point, watching my father laugh, genuinely laugh, unguarded, at something Mateo had said, and felt a grief so unexpected and total that I had to step outside for a moment to collect myself. It was not grief for what was happening in that room. It was grief for the child I had once been, who had wanted exactly this kind of easy, unconditional warmth from my father and had never once received it, who had spent 22 years performing achievement after achievement, hoping to earn a fraction of what my children were now receiving, effortlessly, simply by existing. Diego found me on the back porch and did not say anything at first, simply stood beside me, his hand resting quietly on my shoulder until I was ready to speak. "It's strange," I finally said, watching him be the grandfather I always wanted, for children who didn't have to earn it. "It's not strange," Diego said gently. "It's just late. Late isn't the same as fake, Sophie. He's genuinely trying from what I can see in there. That doesn't erase what happened to you. But it doesn't have to be nothing either, just because it isn't everything. I have thought about that distinction many times in the months since. The difference between late and fake, between imperfect and meaningless. My relationship with my parents has not become what I once, as a child, desperately wished it could be. But it has become something real, built slowly and cautiously on an entirely different foundation than the one that broke the first time. And I have learned to measure it not against the childhood I wished I'd had, but against the honest, complicated present we are all, imperfectly, building together now. Bennett Heights was completed 14 months after the restructuring agreement was signed, opening, finally, nearly 2 years behind its original schedule, but standing, complete and occupied, exactly the kind of project my father had once described as the crown jewel of Bennett Properties' legacy. Though the legacy it ultimately represented, I have come to believe, was never the one my father originally intended. I attended the opening ceremony at my father's invitation, standing beside Diego near the back of a small crowd of investors, city officials, and construction crew members who had spent nearly 4 years of their working lives bringing that project from a 40-acre parcel of assembled land to a completed development of residential towers, a boutique hotel, and thriving ground-floor retail. My father gave a short speech, uncharacteristically humble compared to the grandiose language he'd used at the original groundbreaking years earlier, thanking, by name, several members of the construction crew who had stayed with the project through its most uncertain months, when payroll had occasionally run tight and rumors of the company's potential collapse had spread through the industry. He did not mention Ironcrest Holdings by name in that speech, and I understood, standing there, that this omission was not a slight, but a kind of respect, an acknowledgement, unspoken but real, that the story of how Bennett Heights survived belonged, in its full complexity, to a conversation between our family rather than a public groundbreaking ceremony. Afterward, walking through the completed lobby with its polished stone floors and careful architectural details, my father found me near the elevators and stood beside me for a long moment before speaking. 412 jobs, he said quietly. That's how many people are employed across this project right now, between the residential staff, the hotel, and the retail tenants. I looked up the number last week. I don't know if I ever would have thought to calculate that before all of this happened. I used to think about square footage, sale prices, prestige. I don't think I ever really thought about the actual people, not specifically, not by name, the way you clearly thought about them when you decided to acquire that debt instead of letting someone else take it and gut the whole project. That's the thing about the way Diego does business, I told him. He always thought about the people first. I learned it from watching him, honestly, more than I learned it from any economics class. Numbers only ever tell you part of the story, Dad. They tell you what's at stake. They don't tell you who it actually belongs to. My father nodded slowly, looking out at the lobby full of people, residents moving through with grocery bags, a hotel guest checking in at the front desk, a maintenance worker adjusting something near the entrance. And I watched him take in the scene with an attention that felt, for the first time in my life, genuinely different from the assessing, calculating attention I remembered from childhood. I don't deserve the way you've handled this, he said. Any of it. The restructuring, letting me see the kids, showing up today. I want you to know I understand that, even if I don't fully understand how to earn back what I lost. You don't earn it back all at once, I told him. You just keep showing up, the way you're showing up right now. And eventually, if you're consistent about it, it stops feeling like something owed and starts feeling like something real. That's the only way I know how to explain it. It's the same thing Diego taught me, actually, just about a different kind of trust. We stood together in that lobby for a while longer, not saying much else, simply existing in the same space without an ultimatum or a transaction structuring the terms of it. And I understood, walking out into the afternoon sun with Diego's hand in mine, that this, an ordinary, unremarkable half-hour with my father, requiring nothing of either of us except presence, was the single strangest and most valuable thing Bennett Heights had ultimately produced. I want to go back, for a moment, to the early years of my marriage, before any of the reckoning with my family had begun, because I think there is a piece of this story that lives there, in the ordinary, unglamorous rhythm of watching Diego work. That explains something essential about why I never once regretted the choice that cost me my parents. In the first years after Ironwood Capital's existence had been revealed to me, I spent many Saturdays at the original garage, ostensibly helping with the books, but really, I think, simply wanting to watch him in the environment where he seemed most fully himself. I remember one particular afternoon, maybe 2 years into our marriage, when an elderly man named Mr. Hutchins brought in an aging sedan with a transmission problem eerily similar to the one that had first brought me into that garage years earlier. Mr. Hutchins was, it became clear within minutes of conversation, living on a fixed pension, worried visibly about the cost of the repair before Diego had even finished his diagnosis. Diego explained the problem to him with the same patient, unhurried clarity he'd once used with me, and then quoted him a price that I knew, from my growing familiarity with the shop's actual costs, was barely enough to cover the parts, let alone the hours of labor the repair would require. I asked him about it afterward, once Mr. Hutchins had left, relief visible on his face as he thanked Diego 3 separate times on his way out the door. You basically did that for free, I said. You could have charged him full price. He wouldn't have known the difference. I would have known the difference, Diego said, wiping his hands on a rag, not looking up from the next car already waiting on the lift. That's the whole point, Sophie. I don't do this work to maximize every transaction. I do it because Ernesto taught me that a business is worth building around treating people fairly, and because I happen to also be good enough at other things that I don't need to squeeze an old man's pension to keep the lights on here. The garage was never about the money. It's about staying close to the version of myself I actually like being. I have thought about that afternoon more times than I can count in the years since, especially during the months I spent structuring the restructuring terms for Bennett Heights. Every choice I made in that negotiation, the extended maturity, the reduced interest rate, the equity conversion that gave my father genuine incentive to succeed rather than simply extract value before an inevitable collapse, traced directly back to that Saturday afternoon in the garage, watching a man who could have charged whatever he wanted choose, instead, to charge what was fair. I think this is the piece of the story that matters most, underneath all the drama of the conference room and the restructuring agreement and the years of estrangement. That the entire philosophy which eventually saved my father's company, and by extension 412 jobs, and by further extension the entire foundation of whatever new relationship my parents and I are slowly building now, originated not in some boardroom strategy session, but in a small garage on the edge of town, in the quiet, unglamorous decision of a mechanic to treat an old man's pension with more respect than his own bottom line required. My father spent 30 years building an empire on the theory that value was something you extracted as efficiently as possible from every transaction and every relationship. Diego built his on the opposite theory entirely, that value multiplies over time when you choose fairness even in the moments nobody would notice or reward you for it. I do not think it is a coincidence that one philosophy nearly destroyed everything it built, while the other one, quietly and without fanfare, ended up saving it. Isabella asked me a question, about 8 months after that first visit to our house, that I want to include here because I think it captures something about this entire story, more precisely than almost anything else I could tell you. We were driving home from a weekend visit to Ridgemont Lane. My parents had by then established a regular, careful rhythm of monthly visits, always at our house or somewhere neutral, never yet at the house I'd grown up in, a boundary I was still not ready to cross, and Isabella, 8 years old by then and possessed of an unnervingly perceptive habit of asking exactly the questions adults hoped children wouldn't think to ask, spoke up from the back seat. "Mom," she said, "why did Grandpa Bennett say you weren't his daughter anymore?" Grandma told me that happened when I asked her why we didn't see them when I was little. I glanced at Diego, who met my eyes briefly in the rearview mirror, a silent question about how much I wanted to say. I decided, in that moment, the same way I had decided years earlier with my niece Harper in an entirely different story I would not hear about for several more years, that Isabella deserved honesty sized appropriately to her age, rather than a comfortable evasion that would only leave her more confused later. Grandpa Bennett used to believe that the kind of work someone did told you everything important about who they were, I told her. He thought that because Daddy fixed cars for a living, it meant Daddy wasn't good enough to be part of our family. He was wrong about that, Isabella. Completely wrong. And when I married Daddy anyway, because I loved him, and because I knew Grandpa was wrong, Grandpa decided he didn't want to be my dad anymore. Not while I was married to someone he'd already decided wasn't good enough. Isabella considered this with the particular gravity children bring to ideas too large for their years. "But Daddy owns Ironwood," she said. "He owns lots of things. He's not just fixing cars." "He does now," I said. "But he was already exactly the same person back then that he is today, sweetheart. The businesses didn't make him better. They just made it easier for people like Grandpa to finally see what was already true. That's actually the important lesson here, Bella. Somebody's worth was never about what they owned. It's about who they are underneath that, And Daddy was exactly as wonderful fixing transmissions in a small garage as he is now. So Grandpa was just wrong, Isabella said, with the flat, uncomplicated certainty of an 8-year-old cutting straight to the heart of something adults had spent 9 years and $31 million of debt failing to articulate quite so simply. Yes, I told her. Grandpa was just wrong, and it took him a very long time, and a lot of it was very painful for our family, before he finally understood that. Is he going to be wrong again? She asked, and I heard, underneath the question, something that sounded almost like protectiveness. My daughter, 8 years old, already instinctively guarding the fragile new relationship she'd built with a grandfather she'd only known a matter of months. I don't know, I told her honestly, because I have learned, in the years since Meadow Ridge and the conference room and every other reckoning this world has handed my family, that honesty is always the better gift, even when the honest answer is uncertain. People can keep growing their whole lives if they actually want to. Grandpa seems like he's trying really hard right now, but if he's ever wrong again, in a way that hurts you or hurts our family, you should know that Daddy and I will always protect you from that. The same way I protected myself, eventually, even though it was really hard and took a long time. Isabella nodded, satisfied, apparently, with an answer that acknowledged both hope and uncertainty without pretending either one away, and went back to looking out the window. And I sat there in the passenger seat, watching the road unfold ahead of us, thinking about how strange and unexpected it was that the hardest, most honest conversation of my adult life had ended up taking place in a car with an 8-year-old on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, rather than in any of the dramatic rooms where the actual events of this story had unfolded. I mentioned earlier, briefly, that my father sent me exactly 2 pieces of communication during the years of our estrangement: a Christmas card with no personal note, and a terse email informing me of my grandmother's funeral arrangements. I want to slow down on that second piece, because I did not give it the space it deserved earlier, and because I think it illustrates, more precisely than almost anything else, exactly how narrow the door my parents left open for me actually was. My grandmother, my father's mother, a quiet, gentle woman named Eleanor who had, in my early childhood, been one of the few relatives who never seemed to weigh my worth against Whitney's, who kept a drawer of butterscotch candies specifically for me because she'd noticed, one Thanksgiving when I was 6, that I liked them better than the peppermints she kept for everyone else. Died 4 years into my marriage, of a stroke, quickly and without prolonged illness. I learned about her death from a 2-line email, sent from my father's business account rather than any personal one, informing me of the date, time, and location of the funeral, with no expression of grief, no acknowledgement that I might be grieving too, no invitation beyond the bare, technical fact of when and where the service would occur. I remember reading that email standing in our kitchen, Isabella not yet born, Diego still at the garage, and feeling a grief so total and so completely unacknowledged by the people who should have shared it with me that I did not know, for several minutes, whether I was even allowed to cry. I went to the funeral. I want to be honest that I debated it for nearly 2 days, uncertain whether my presence would be welcomed or simply tolerated as an unfortunate technicality of blood relation, but I could not imagine missing the chance to say goodbye to the one member of that family who had never once made me feel like a disappointment. Diego drove me, though he waited in the car outside the church at my request, understanding, without needing it explained, that my presence there would already be complicated enough, without further complicating it with his. I sat in the back pew, arriving after the family had already been seated at the front, and I watched my father deliver a eulogy about his mother's kindness, her generosity, her unconditional love for every member of the family, language that landed, sitting there alone in the back of that church, with an irony so sharp it nearly took my breath away, given that the man delivering it had spent the last 4 years demonstrating none of those qualities toward his own daughter. Whitney found me afterward in the reception hall and hugged me stiffly, the kind of hug performed more for the benefit of onlookers than out of genuine warmth, and told me, quietly, that Mom and Dad probably wouldn't want a scene. A sentence I understood immediately as a request that I not approach them directly, that I keep my grief contained to the margins of the room the same way I had apparently been contained to the margins of the family itself. I did not approach them. I stood near the back of that reception hall, holding a cup of coffee I did not drink, watching a family I had once belonged to move through their shared grief in a tight, closed circle that had no space in it for me. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that has never fully left me, that this specific quiet exclusion at a funeral, more than the original ultimatum itself, was the moment I finally, fully accepted that my parents' rejection was not a temporary punishment I might someday work my way back out of through good behavior or enough time. It was simply, permanently, who they had decided to be. I left an hour into the reception, found Diego waiting exactly where he'd said he would be, and cried in the passenger seat of his truck for the entire drive home, grieving not only my grandmother, but the family I had, until that afternoon, still been quietly hoping might someday find its way back to me. I tell this story because I think it matters to understanding exactly how far the eventual reconciliation traveled, not from a single dramatic reveal in a conference room, but from a woman standing alone at the back of a funeral reception, believing, with total and reasonable certainty, that this particular door had closed permanently. The fact that it eventually opened again does not erase that afternoon. It simply means that grief and healing, in a family as broken as mine had become, do not always travel in a straight line, and sometimes the deepest wounds are not the dramatic ones, but the quiet, procedural ones. An email with no warmth in it, a funeral with no seat saved. I want to tell you about a professional milestone that happened about 2 years into my time at Ironwood Capital, well before Bennett Properties Group ever crossed my desk, because I think it matters to understanding who I had become by the time that fateful file finally did arrive. Not simply Diego's wife, working at his company on his terms, but a professional in my own right, who had earned her position through demonstrated competence rather than marital convenience. Renee Okoye assigned me, in my second year, to lead due diligence on a complicated acquisition target on my own, a mid-sized regional grocery chain called Fresh Fields that had fallen into distress after an ambitious, poorly executed expansion into a neighboring state left it carrying debt its actual revenue could not support. It was, by every account, a messier and more difficult acquisition than anything I had handled before, complicated further by a founding family that was, in ways that felt eerily familiar even then, deeply resistant to any restructuring that diluted their control, viewing the very existence of outside investment as a personal insult to their decades of independent ownership. I spent 4 months on that acquisition, working largely without Diego's direct involvement. He had deliberately stepped back from day-to-day oversight of my projects specifically to ensure that my successes and failures would be unambiguously my own, a decision I did not fully appreciate until much later, when I understood how carefully he'd protected my professional credibility from the very beginning. I negotiated directly with Fresh Fields' founding family, a contentious, often difficult process that required me to hold firm against pressure while still finding a structure that let the family retain meaningful involvement in a business their grandfather had built from a single storefront. The same origin story, I noted privately, as so many of the distressed companies Ironwood Capital eventually acquired. The deal closed successfully, saving nearly 900 jobs across 11 grocery locations, and Fresh Fields has, in the years since, become one of Ironwood Capital's most consistently profitable holdings, expanded carefully back to its original, sustainable footprint under leadership that still includes 2 members of the founding family in senior roles. Renee told me at the closing dinner celebrating that acquisition, something I have carried with me ever since. "You have your husband's eye for value," she said, "but you negotiate harder than he does. He wants everyone to leave the table happy. You want everyone to leave the table fairly treated, which isn't always the same thing, and it makes you better at the parts of this job that require someone to hold a firm line." I mention this acquisition specifically because I think it explains something important about the confidence I carried into that conference room with my father, years later. I did not walk into that meeting as Diego Cruz's wife, borrowing his authority to finally settle an old score. I walked in as a director of acquisitions who had, by that point, personally structured and closed over a dozen successful restructurings, who understood distressed debt as intimately as my father understood real estate development, who had built her own professional credibility from scratch, the same patient, unglamorous way Diego had built his empire from a single garage. My father, I think, assumed for most of that meeting that I was simply present as Diego's wife, a detail that made his eventual understanding, over the following months, of exactly how central my own professional judgment had been to the restructuring's fair terms, land with a particular, humbling weight. I was not simply married to the man who saved his company. I was the person who had actually designed the terms of that salvation, drawing on years of expertise he had never once thought to ask me about, because he had never once, in all our years of estrangement, imagined that the daughter he'd disowned might have built something entirely her own worth taking seriously. I want to tell you about something unexpected that happened about a year after the conference room, because I think it offers a strange, useful mirror to everything else in this story. Kayla, Diego's ex-girlfriend from years before we met, the woman whose betrayal had shaped his entire approach to revealing his wealth, reached out to him through a mutual contact, requesting a meeting to discuss what she described, vaguely, as a potential business opportunity. Diego told me about the request the same evening he received it, laying it out plainly, the way he laid out everything important between us, and asked what I thought he should do. I want to be honest that my first instinct was a flare of old, protective anger, a fierce, immediate desire to tell him not to waste a single minute on a woman who had once treated him as a bank account rather than a person. But I also understood, sitting with the request longer, that Diego had built an entire career, an entire philosophy, around the idea that people were not permanently defined by their worst moments, that value and character deserve to be assessed honestly rather than assumed, and I recognized that if I asked him to refuse Kayla out of hand, purely on the basis of old history, I would be asking him to abandon exactly the principle that had, eventually, saved my own father. Diego agreed to a brief meeting at a public coffee shop and told me about it afterward in detail. Kayla, it turned out, was seeking investment for a small nonprofit she had founded 5 years earlier, providing financial literacy education to young women in underserved communities, an organization that had, according to the modest research Diego did beforehand, a genuinely strong track record, but had struggled, for years, to attract serious funding. She had not, Diego told me, asked him for money directly, or referenced their old relationship at all, beyond a brief, visibly uncomfortable acknowledgement at the start of the meeting. She had come with a pitch deck, financial statements, and a clear, well-researched case for why her organization deserved investment, treating him, for the entire conversation, exactly as she would have treated any other potential funder. A stranger with capital. Rather than a former partner, she might once have tried a different, more personal angle on. "She's changed," Diego told me that night, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where he had once revealed the full scope of Ironwood Capital to me. Or maybe she always had this in her, and I just never saw it, because by the time I knew her, money had already made her worse instead of better. I don't know which it is, but the work she's doing is real, Sophie. The numbers check out. I think we should fund it. I sat with that for a moment, feeling the old, protective instinct war with something else, a recognition, slow and a little humbling, of exactly how much grace this entire story had required from everyone involved in order to reach anything resembling healing. My father had needed grace. My mother had needed grace. I had needed to extend it, imperfectly and gradually, to people who had once told me I wasn't worth claiming. It seemed, sitting there, a strange kind of hypocrisy to withhold that same grace from a woman Diego had once loved, simply because her failure had happened to hurt him personally rather than me. Fund it, I told him. Not because she deserves a second chance from us specifically, because the work itself is good, and because you built your whole life around the idea that people's worth isn't fixed by their worst chapter. If that's actually true, it has to be true for her too, not just for the people it's convenient to believe it about. Ironwood Capital funded Kayla's organization the following month, a modest but meaningful grant that allowed her to expand into 2 additional cities. I have never met her myself, and I do not know if I ever will, but I think about that decision often because it taught me something I had not fully understood before, that the philosophy which saved my own family, the belief that people are not simply and permanently the worst thing anyone ever assumed about them, only means something if you are willing to extend it even to the people who have personally wronged you, not just the ones whose redemption happens to be convenient. I want to tell you about one more scene before I close this story, because I think it is, in its own quiet way, the moment that mattered most to me personally, even more than the conference room, even more than the Christmas at Ridgemont Lane, the afternoon Ernesto Cruz finally met my parents. It happened almost 18 months after the restructuring closed, at a small gathering Diego and I hosted at our house to celebrate Isabella's 9th birthday, an event that had by then grown to include both sides of our family without any of the careful, deliberate structuring that had governed our earlier reconciliation efforts. My parents arrived early to help set up, a detail that would have been unimaginable to me a few years earlier, and Ernesto arrived shortly after, driving the same well-maintained but unglamorous pickup truck he had driven for as long as Diego had known him, dressed in his usual plain, comfortable clothes, carrying a wrapped gift he had clearly selected with real thought rather than obligation. I watched my father cross the yard to meet him, and I felt, in that moment, a tension I had not fully anticipated, a worry, old and reflexive, that some remnant of the man who had once judged Diego by his coveralls might resurface in how he greeted the uncle who had raised him, a man who, whatever his nephew's eventual wealth, remained, by every visible marker, exactly what my father had once dismissed as beneath our family's standards. I did not need to worry. My father extended his hand to Ernesto with a warmth and a genuine deference that startled me, and the two of them spent nearly 20 minutes standing near the grill, deep in conversation, before I finally worked up the courage to approach and hear what they were discussing. They were talking about ironwood trees. My father, it turned out, had been reading about them since learning the origin of Diego's holding company's name, genuinely curious about the specific variety Ernesto's mother had given him decades earlier, and Ernesto was explaining, with the same patient, unhurried care Diego brought to everything, the particular growing conditions the tree required, how long it had taken to reach the height it stood at now behind the original garage, a detail Diego had told me, but that I had never heard explained with quite this much loving specificity. "You raised a remarkable young man," my father told Ernesto, at one point in that conversation, his voice carrying a sincerity I had rarely heard from him, even in our own most honest conversations. I wish I'd understood that 9 years ago. I judged him by what he did with his hands instead of asking what he'd built with his character, and I cost my daughter and myself nearly a decade because of it. Ernesto, who I had warned, gently, about the history between our families before the party, listened to this with the same calm equanimity he brought to everything, and then said something that I have thought about many times since, because I believe it captures, more precisely than anything else in this story, the actual philosophy underneath everything Diego had built. "I never taught that boy to want anyone's approval," Ernesto said. "Not mine, not yours, not anybody's. I taught him to do good work, and to be fair to people, and to love the people who chose to stand beside him. The approval was never the point, Mr. Bennett. It's just a nice thing that happens sometimes, when people finally catch up to what was true the whole time." My father nodded slowly, and I watched something settle in his face, not quite peace, but something adjacent to it. The particular expression of a man finally hearing, articulated plainly by someone with no reason to flatter him, the exact lesson his own family should have taught him 2 generations earlier, before it ever had the chance to cost him a daughter. Isabella's birthday party continued around us, children running through the yard, Whitney's family mingling easily with mine, my mother deep in conversation with Diego near the dessert table about a recipe she wanted to teach Isabella. And I stood there for a long moment, watching 2 men who represented the 2 entirely different philosophies of family that had shaped my entire adult life, finally standing together in the same backyard, speaking to each other with genuine, unguarded respect. I do not think that moment erased anything that happened before it. I do not think a single afternoon of warmth between my father and Ernesto undid 9 years of estrangement, or a funeral I attended alone, or an ultimatum delivered across a dining room table that had once felt like the end of everything I understood about belonging. But I think it marked something important nonetheless. The moment I finally allowed myself to believe that the family I had built, imperfect and hard-won and deliberately different from the one I grew up in, was strong enough now to hold both halves of my history at once, without either one threatening to undo the other. I want to end this story with a scene that happened 2 years after that first conference room, because I think it captures, better than any single confrontation or reveal, the actual, complicated shape of what healing looked like for my family. My father invited us to Ridgemont Lane for Christmas. The first time I had set foot in that house since the afternoon I packed my car and drove away nearly a decade earlier. I said yes cautiously, the same careful, deliberate yes I had learned to give every step of this slow rebuilding, and I remember sitting in the car outside that circular driveway, the same imported maples lining the path, feeling a strange, vertiginous collision of every version of myself that had ever existed in relation to that house. The child who grew up there, the young woman who was cast out of it, the mother now bringing her own children through its front door for the first time. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood homes often do once you've built a life large enough of your own to measure them against. My mother had decorated it, I noticed, differently than I remembered from my own childhood. Warmer, somehow, less museum-like, with a Christmas tree covered in ornaments that included several clearly handmade by Isabella and Mateo during a craft afternoon my mother had organized with them the previous month, a detail that struck me as almost unbearably tender, given how little maternal warmth I remembered from my own childhood holidays in that same room. Whitney and her family were there too, her children and mine tumbling together through the house with the easy, uncomplicated affection of cousins who had, in the 2 years since that first reconnection, become genuinely close. Bradley, my brother-in-law, shook Diego's hand warmly, and I watched the two of them fall into an easy conversation about a car Bradley had been trying to restore. Diego offering advice with the same patient generosity he'd once offered a stranger in a strip mall parking lot. My father found me in the kitchen at one point, both of us alone for a moment while everyone else gathered in the living room, and he handed me a small, carefully wrapped box, telling me, a little awkwardly, that it wasn't a Christmas gift exactly, more something he'd been meaning to give me for a while and hadn't found the right moment for. I opened it to find a small, worn photograph, myself at maybe 6 years old, sitting on my father's shoulders at some long-forgotten summer festival, both of us laughing at something outside the frame, an image I had no memory of and did not know existed. "I found it going through old boxes a few months ago," he said. "I don't even remember what we were laughing at. But I remember thinking, when I found it, that I'd spent so many years being the father who told you what you weren't allowed to be, that I'd almost completely forgotten there was ever a version of us that looked like this. I wanted you to have it, not to make up for anything. Just so you'd know that version existed too, somewhere underneath everything that came after." I stood in that kitchen, holding a photograph of a father and daughter who had not yet learned how badly they would eventually fail each other, and felt something in my chest finally, fully release. Not forgiveness in the simple, complete sense that erases what happened, because I do not believe that kind of forgiveness is honest or even particularly healthy, but something adjacent to it, something closer to acceptance. The understanding that my father had been, across the arc of my entire life, several different men. The one who once carried me on his shoulders, the one who told me I wasn't his daughter anymore, and the one standing in front of me now, older and humbled and trying, imperfectly but genuinely, to become someone new. "Thank you," I told him, and I meant it completely, in a way I would not have been capable of meaning 2 years earlier. We spent that Christmas together, the whole complicated family of us, and I watched my children build a snowman with their grandfather in the same front yard where I had once, decades earlier, learned to ride a bicycle he'd bought me. And I understood, standing at the window watching them, exactly how far this particular story had traveled. From a dining room table where I was told I wasn't wanted, to a snow-covered yard where an entirely new generation was being shown, for the first time in this family's history, that love did not require a price of admission at all. There is a small detail I have not yet mentioned in this story that I want to include before I close it, because I think it says something true about the particular way I chose to carry my history forward, rather than simply discarding it. I never changed my last name after my father's ultimatum. Not legally, not even informally in the years that followed. I want to explain why, because I think people sometimes assume, hearing this story, that I must have shed the Bennett name the same day I packed my car, a clean, symbolic severing to match the emotional one. I did take Diego's name upon marriage. I am legally Sophie Cruz now, have been for 9 years. But for most of that time, professionally and in the quiet corners of my own identity, I continued thinking of myself, at least partially, as a Bennett, even while the family that name represented had made unmistakably clear that they no longer claimed me. I have thought hard about why I held on to that connection, even through the years of complete estrangement, and I think the truest answer is this. My father's cruelty was real, and it cost me enormously, but it was never the entirety of what that name meant to me. There was also my grandmother Eleanor's butterscotch candies, and her unconditional warmth, taken from me too soon and too incompletely mournedly. There was a childhood that, whatever its later distortions, had also contained genuine moments of belonging before the conditions attached themselves so completely to every interaction. There was, underneath the specific, devastating failure of my father's ultimatum, a longer, more complicated family history that I was not willing to let a single terrible dinner erase entirely. I told Diego this once, early in our marriage, when he gently asked whether I wanted to formally distance myself further from a family that had treated me so poorly. I don't want to give them the power to define what that name means, I told him. If I let their cruelty be the only story the name Bennett tells, I'm letting them win a fight I don't think they even understood we were having. I'd rather hold on to the whole complicated truth of it, the good grandmother and the terrible ultimatum both, than pretend the name only ever meant one simple thing. I think this choice mattered enormously, in the end, to how the eventual reconciliation with my parents was able to unfold. Because I had never fully surrendered my connection to that family, even in its most broken years, there remained, underneath all the hurt, a thread that my father could eventually, painstakingly, find his way back to we. Not because I had made it easy for him, but because I had refused to let his failure be the only thing that name would ever mean to me, or to the children I would eventually raise to understand both halves of their complicated inheritance. Isabella and Mateo carry the Cruz name, but they know the Bennett history too, now. Not just the difficult parts, though I have never hidden those from them, but the parts that came before the ultimatum and the parts that came after the reconciliation. The whole complicated, unfinished story of a family that broke badly and is still, slowly and imperfectly, learning how to mend. I think that is, in the end, the truest thing I can tell you about how healing actually works. More true than any single dramatic reveal in any conference room. It does not require erasing the parts of your history that hurt you. It requires holding the whole of it honestly. The cruelty and the kindness, the ultimatum and the butterscotch candies, the 11 months or 9 years of exile and the slow, hard-won rebuilding that eventually followed. And choosing, deliberately, which parts you want to carry forward into the family you are still, every single day, in the process of building. I want to tell you about one more small tradition before I close this story, because I think it captures, better than almost anything else, exactly what kind of family Diego and I have built in the years since that conference room, and exactly what we intend to keep protecting as our children grow older. Every Saturday morning, weather permitting, Diego takes Mateo to the original garage, the same one where I once broke down in a strip mall parking lot, the same one Ernesto still visits twice a week to put his hands somewhere useful. Mateo is 6 now, too young to do any real mechanical work, but old enough to hand his father tools, to ask endless questions about how engines work, to sit on an overturned crate watching 2 generations of Cruz men bent over an open hood with the same patient, unhurried focus that first drew me to Diego all those years ago. I asked Diego once, watching this ritual from the garage's small office window, whether he worried that Mateo, growing up now with every material advantage Ironwood Capital's success could provide, might lose touch with the values that had actually built that success in the first place. The fairness, the patience, the quiet dignity of honest work. The things Ernesto had taught a grieving 9-year-old boy in that same garage decades earlier. That's exactly why we keep coming here, Diego told me. Money doesn't teach a kid anything on its own. It just removes obstacles. What actually shapes who Mateo becomes is watching his dad get his hands dirty every Saturday, watching Ernesto explain the same principle for the 40th time without ever losing patience, understanding that the garage isn't beneath us just because we don't need the income from it anymore. It's part of who we are. I don't ever want my kids to think there's a version of success that makes this kind of work unworthy of their time. I have watched this lesson take root in ways that move me more than almost anything else about our family life. Mateo, at 6 years old, already corrects other children at school who tease a classmate about a parent who works just as a plumber or just as a cashier. Telling them, with the same blunt, uncomplicated certainty his sister once used to diagnose Grandpa Bennett's mistakes. That just isn't a real word for what people do to take care of their families. My father visits the garage now too, occasionally. On the Saturdays he comes to see his grandchildren, a detail that still, honestly, sometimes catches me off guard when I witness it. The man who once told me a mechanic wasn't good enough to be family now standing beside that same mechanic's uncle, learning, slowly and a little clumsily, how to change his own oil, insisting, with a stubbornness I recognize as distinctly his own, that a man my age should know how to do this himself instead of paying someone else for every small thing. Ernesto has taken to calling my father Gerald now, without any of the formal distance either man might once have maintained, and I watched them, just last month, standing together at that same workbench. My father asking careful, genuinely curious questions about a carburetor, while Ernesto explained it with the same patient generosity he'd once extended to a lonely 9-year-old boy who'd lost everything. I do not think my father will ever fully become the kind of man Ernesto is. Some lessons, learned too late in life, only ever partially take root, and I have made peace with that limitation rather than expecting a complete transformation that would ask more of a 60-something-year-old man than is probably realistic. But I watch him in that garage now, hands genuinely dirty for what I suspect is the first time in his adult life, and I recognize, in the small, unglamorous effort of it, something that would have been unimaginable to the man who once delivered an ultimatum across a dining room table 9 years earlier, a willingness, however late and however imperfect, to finally get his hands dirty in service of understanding a kind of worth he had spent his entire life dismissing. I want to step back, near the end of this story, and give Diego the space to be more than a plot device in his own life, because I am aware, telling this story, that it would be easy to reduce him to a single dramatic reveal, the poor mechanic who turned out to be secretly wealthy, rather than the fully realized person I married, whose worth, as he told my father directly, had never actually depended on Ironwood Capital's existence at all. I asked him once, in the months after the conference room, whether any part of him had wanted, over the years, to reveal his wealth to my parents sooner, to end the years of judgment with a single decisive unveiling rather than waiting for circumstance to force the reveal on its own timeline. No, he said, without hesitation, the same immediate certainty he'd given me the very first time I'd asked him something similar, years earlier. I want to explain why, because I don't think it's the answer people expect. It's not about pride, or wanting to make them wait longer to suffer, or any of that. It's that revealing it on purpose would have meant admitting, on some level, that their approval actually mattered to me. And it never did, Sophie. Not once. I built Ironwood Capital because I loved the work, because Ernesto taught me that building things carefully and fairly was worth doing for its own sake. If I'd ever shown your parents what I owned specifically to change their minds about me, I would have been telling myself a lie about what actually motivated me all along. I have thought about that distinction many times since, because I think it is the truest thing anyone has said in this entire story, and the thing I most want anyone listening to carry away from it. Diego never needed my parents' approval to know his own worth. He simply continued being exactly who he was, patient, fair, quietly extraordinary in a garage most people would have overlooked entirely, and let the world catch up to that truth on its own schedule without ever bending himself to accelerate the process. This is different, I want to be clear, from the story of quiet vindication that this entire narrative might otherwise seem to be building toward. The satisfying reveal, the comeuppance, the moment the doubters are finally, dramatically proven wrong. Diego never once, in 9 years, structured his life around waiting for that moment. He built Ironwood Capital because building things well brought him genuine satisfaction. He kept working in the garage because he loved the actual mechanical work, not because he was performing humility for an eventual audience. The reveal to my father was, in the truest sense, an accident of circumstance, a debt position that happened to cross both our lives, rather than the culmination of some long-game strategy Diego had been quietly executing since our wedding day. I think this matters enormously because I have come to believe, across everything my family went through, that the healthiest kind of self-worth is exactly this: worth that exists independently of whether anyone else ever recognizes it, worth that would have remained completely intact even if my father had never discovered the truth. Even if Bennett Properties Group had simply collapsed under its own weight with Diego's identity as its creditor remaining forever anonymous. Diego would have been exactly as worthy a husband, exactly as good a father, exactly as remarkable a man, in that alternate version of events where my father never learned the truth at all. I asked him once whether he ever felt cheated of the satisfaction other people might assume he'd feel, the pure, uncomplicated triumph of finally being proven right about his own worth. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything, before answering. "The satisfaction I actually feel," he said, "isn't about being proven right. It's watching you get your family back, imperfectly and slowly, on terms that finally respect you. It's watching your dad build blocks with Mateo instead of asking him what school he's going to attend someday. That's the part that actually matters to me, Sophie. Everything else, the money, the reveal, the restructuring, that was just the mechanism. The actual point was always you and the family we were building, regardless of whether your parents ever came around to seeing it clearly." I have carried that answer with me every day since, because I think it names, more precisely than anything else in this entire story, the difference between revenge and genuine healing. Revenge would have been enjoying my father's shock in that conference room for its own sake, savoring the reversal, extracting every possible ounce of vindication from a moment I had, in some sense, waited 9 years to witness. What I actually felt, and what Diego actually built his entire life around, was something quieter and far more durable. The simple, patient work of becoming exactly who you already are, regardless of who is watching, and letting that truth, eventually, speak for itself on its own unhurried timeline. I want to include one more piece of this story before the closing chapter, because I think it matters to an honest telling of how the restructuring actually unfolded. The fact that not everyone at Ironwood Capital simply trusted my judgment on the Bennett Properties acquisition without question, and the fact that I had to earn that trust in the moment, the same way I had earned everything else at the company. Ironwood Capital's board included, alongside Diego and myself, 4 independent members brought in over the years specifically to provide outside oversight and prevent exactly the kind of conflict of interest blind spots that can quietly damage even well-intentioned companies. One of them, a sharp, exacting former investment banker named Richard Delacroix, raised a formal objection during the board's review of the Bennett Properties restructuring terms, questioning, directly and without any attempt at diplomacy, whether my personal history with the borrower compromised my ability to structure a deal that served Ironwood Capital's actual financial interests rather than my own complicated family reconciliation. "I want to be clear, this isn't personal," Delacroix said, during the board meeting where the restructuring terms were formally presented for approval, 3 weeks before that closing meeting in my father's attorney's office. "But we have a fiduciary responsibility to this fund's investors, and the terms in front of us are considerably more generous than Ironcrest's typical restructuring template. I'd like Sophie to walk us through, specifically, why these terms represent the best financial outcome for this fund, independent of any personal history involved. I remember feeling a flare of defensiveness in that moment, quickly followed by a recognition that Delacroix's objection was, in fact, exactly the kind of scrutiny a well-run company should apply, regardless of how uncomfortable it felt to be on the receiving end of it. I did not ask Diego to intervene on my behalf, though I could see, glancing briefly in his direction, that he was prepared to if I wanted him to. I answered the question myself, the way I had answered every difficult negotiation question throughout my career at Ironwood Capital. I walked the board through the actual financial modeling, the comparative analysis of forced liquidation versus structured restructuring, the historical data on how similarly restructured real estate debt positions had performed across Ironwood's broader portfolio, the specific projected returns on the preferred equity conversion that gave the fund meaningful upside participation in Bennett Heights' eventual success, rather than simply collecting a fixed interest rate on a position that carried real risk of eventual default. I demonstrated, with the same rigor I had brought to the Freshfields acquisition years earlier, that the terms were not generous out of sentiment. They were generous because the underlying analysis supported exactly this structure as the highest expected value outcome for the fund's investors, regardless of who happened to be sitting on the other side of the negotiating table. Delacroix listened to the entire presentation without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "That's a sound analysis," he said finally. "I'll be honest, Sophie. I came into this meeting expecting to find evidence that your objectivity had slipped. I don't see that evidence. I see a well-structured deal that happens to also resolve a complicated personal situation. I'm satisfied. I'd like the record to reflect that I raised the objection and that it was thoroughly and professionally addressed." The board approved the restructuring terms unanimously that same afternoon, and I remember feeling, walking out of that meeting, a particular kind of pride that was entirely separate from anything related to my father. Not the satisfaction of vindication against my family, but the quieter, more durable satisfaction of having my professional judgment tested rigorously and having it hold up completely on its own merits. I tell this part of the story because I think it matters to understanding exactly how seriously I took the responsibility of that restructuring, long before my father ever walked into that conference room and discovered who was sitting across from him. I was never simply extending a personal favor disguised as a business deal. I built terms that were genuinely, defensibly, the right terms for the situation. Terms that would have been identical whether the borrower had been my own father or a complete stranger, and I made sure, through Delacroix's rigorous questioning, that this fact was documented and verified before the deal ever closed. It mattered to me, more than I think I fully understood until that board meeting, that nobody could ever credibly claim my father received anything he had not, in the most rigorous financial sense, actually earned through the strength of a fair, well-structured agreement. I have told this story now, from beginning to end, and I want to close it the way I have learned these stories often close, not with triumph exactly, but with something quieter and more durable, the kind of strength that never needed to raise its voice to prove itself real. There is a small carved figure that sits on the windowsill above our kitchen sink now, a wooden panda that Diego bought me on our 5th anniversary, years before any of the events in this story unfolded, back when it was simply a small, whimsical gift, rather than anything symbolic. I did not understand, when he gave it to me, why he'd chosen it specifically, until he explained, a little sheepishly, that he'd read somewhere that pandas were solitary, self-sufficient creatures, capable of enormous strength despite their calm, unhurried appearance, and that something about that description had reminded him of me, a woman who had walked away from an entire inherited life, alone, without any certainty of what waited on the other side, and had built something extraordinary anyway, on her own patient terms. I think about that small wooden panda every time I look at it now, sitting on the windowsill where the morning light catches it while I make coffee, and I think about everything it has come to represent in the years since Diego first gave it to me. Not just my own quiet resilience, but the entire philosophy that eventually saved my father's company and slowly, imperfectly, rebuilt my family. The understanding that the loudest, most aggressive response to being wronged is rarely the most powerful one. Sometimes the truest strength is simply continuing, steadily and without spectacle, to build a life so solid and so genuinely your own that when the people who once discarded you finally come looking for what you've built, they find not a bitter stranger seeking revenge, but someone calm enough and secure enough to decide, entirely on her own terms, exactly how much room to make for them. My father spent 30 years believing that a person's worth could be calculated, sorted, and dismissed based on the work their hands performed. It took a mechanic's quiet, patient empire, built entirely without any need for his approval, to finally teach him otherwise. I do not know if he will ever fully understand how much that lesson cost our family to learn, or how many years of ordinary, unremarkable love, birthday parties, bedtime stories, easy Sunday dinners, were lost in the process of teaching it to him. I think often about the version of this story where the debt file never crossed my desk, where some other fund acquired Bennett Properties Group's mezzanine debt, and my father's company simply collapsed, quietly, the way so many overextended companies do, without any reckoning, without any reconciliation, without Isabella ever learning her grandfather's laugh, or Mateo ever handing him a wrench in that small garage on Saturday mornings. I do not know what would have become of my relationship with my parents in that version of events. Perhaps the estrangement would have simply calcified permanently, an old wound neither side ever found the occasion or the courage to reopen. Perhaps my father would have grown old and died still believing that the choices I made at 23 had cost me everything, never once learning how wrong that belief had been. I am grateful, more than I can fully express, that this is not the version of events I ultimately have to carry, but I want to be honest in closing this story that the reconciliation was never guaranteed, was never owed to me, and was never something I built my own healing around waiting for. I had already built a complete, genuinely happy life with Diego and our children long before that debt file ever appeared on my desk. A life full of Saturday mornings in the garage, birthday parties with a wooden panda catching the morning light, a marriage built on the kind of unconditional love I had never once experienced growing up on Ridgemont Lane. The reconciliation with my parents, when it finally arrived, was not the missing piece that completed that life. It was simply an additional gift, unexpected and hard-won, layered onto a foundation that had already been whole without it. I think that distinction matters enormously for anyone listening to this story who recognizes their own family's cruelty in it, and who is waiting, the way I once quietly waited, for some future reckoning to finally prove their worth to people who have shown, through their actions, exactly how conditional their love actually is. Do not build your life around that eventual reckoning. Build your life the way Diego built Ironwood Capital, patiently, honestly, for its own sake. Because the work itself is worth doing, and the person you're becoming is worth becoming. Regardless of whether the people who once discarded you ever find their way back to understanding it. If they do find their way back, and I hope, for your sake, that some of them eventually will, the way my father eventually did, let it be a gift you receive with open eyes rather than a debt they finally, belatedly, repaid. And if they never do, if some doors simply stay closed, no matter how much patient, unglamorous work you put into building a life worth returning to, I want you to know that the life itself was still worth building. It was always worth building, whether or not anyone ever walked back through that door to see it. If you are listening to this and you recognize some piece of yourself in it, if you have ever been told your choices made you unworthy of a family's love, if you have ever watched people decide your value based on a single dinner, a single job title, a single misjudged glance, I want you to know that the reckoning, if it comes at all, rarely arrives the way you imagine it in your angriest moments. It arrives quietly, slowly, built one patient decision at a time, by a person who stopped waiting for anyone else's permission to know exactly what they were worth. Build that life anyway. Build it in a small garage, or a beige hospital room, or wherever the world has decided to overlook you. I promise you, from the other side of everything my family put me through, that it is worth every unglamorous, unwitnessed hour it costs you. And that someday, whether or not the people who doubted you ever fully understand it, you will look back and recognize that the life you built quietly, on your own terms, was always the actual victory. Everything else was just the world, eventually, catching up to a truth you'd known about yourself the whole time. I think about the small wooden panda on our windowsill almost every morning now, and I think about the two very different inheritances my children are growing up with. Ernesto's patient, unhurried ironwood tree on one side, and slowly, imperfectly, a grandfather finally learning to plant something worth growing on the other. Neither inheritance required the other to become real. But I am grateful, more than I ever expected to be, that both of them now belong to my children at once, woven together into a family that finally, after everything, understands that worth was never something to be calculated in the first place. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, I hope you carry a piece of it with you. The patient, unhurried strength of someone who never needed anyone else's approval to know exactly what they were worth.